New Millennium Audio presents
The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, read by the author.
Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded, yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 92 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet, whose ape-descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea. This planet has, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Most of the people living on it were unhappy for pretty much of the time. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with the movements of small green pieces of paper, which is odd because on the whole it wasn't the small green pieces of paper that were unhappy. And so the problem remained. Lots of the people were mean, and most of them were miserable, even the ones with digital watches. Many were increasingly of the opinion that they'd all made a big mistake in coming down from the trees in the first place, and some said that even the trees had been a bad move, and that no one should ever have left the oceans. And then, one Thursday, nearly 2,000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change, a girl sitting on her own in a small cafe in Rickmansworth suddenly realized what it was that had been going wrong all this time. And she finally knew how the world could be made a good and happy place. This time it was right, it would work, and no one would have to get nailed to anything. Sadly, however, before she could get to a phone to tell anyone about it, a terrible, stupid catastrophe occurred, and the idea was lost forever. This is not her story. But it is the story of that terrible, stupid catastrophe and some of its consequences. It is also the story of a book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Not an Earth book, never published on Earth, and until the terrible catastrophe occurred, never seen or even heard of by any Earthman. Nevertheless, a wholly remarkable book. In fact, it was probably the most remarkable book ever to come out of the great publishing corporations of Ursa Minor, of which no Earthman had ever heard either. Not only is it a wholly remarkable book, it is also a highly successful one, more popular than the Celestial Home Care Omnibus, better selling than 53 More Things to Do in Zero Gravity, and more controversial than Ulon Kolufid's trilogy of philosophical blockbusters Where God Went Wrong, some more of God's greatest mistakes, and Who is this God person anyway? In many of the more relaxed civilizations on the outer eastern rim of the galaxy, the Hitchhiker's Guide has already supplanted the great Encyclopedia Galactica as the standard repository of all knowledge and wisdom. For though it has many omissions and contains much that is apocryphal, or at least wildly inaccurate, it scores over the older, more pedestrian work in two important respects. First, it is slightly cheaper, and secondly, it has the words, "Don't Panic," inscribed in large, friendly letters on its cover. But the story of this terrible, stupid Thursday, the story of its extraordinary consequences, and the story of how these consequences are inextricably intertwined with this remarkable book, begins very simply. It begins with a house. Chapter 1. The house stood on a slight rise just on the edge of the village. It stood on its own and looked out over a broad spread of West Country farmland. Not a remarkable house by any means. It was about 30 years old, squattish, squarish, made of brick, and had 4 windows set in the front of a size and proportion which more or less exactly failed to please the eye. The only person for whom the house was in any way special was Arthur Dent, and that was only because it happened to be the one he lived in. He had lived in it for about 3 years, ever since he had moved out of London, because it made him nervous and irritable. He was about 30 as well, tall, dark-haired, and never quite at ease with himself. The thing that used to worry him most was the fact that people always used to ask him what he was looking so worried about. He worked in local radio, which he always used to tell his friends was a lot more interesting than they probably thought. It was, too. Most of his friends worked in advertising. On Wednesday night it had rained very heavily. The lane was wet and muddy, but the Thursday morning sun was bright and clear as it shone on Arthur Dent's house for what was to be the last time. It hadn't properly registered yet with Arthur that the council wanted to knock it down and build a bypass instead. At 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, Arthur didn't feel very good. He woke up blearily, got up, wandered blearily round his room, opened a window, saw a bulldozer, found his slippers and stomped off to the bathroom to wash. Toothpaste on the brush, so scrub. Shaving mirror, pointing at the ceiling. He adjusted it. For a moment it reflected a second bulldozer through the bathroom window. Properly adjusted, it reflected Arthur Dent's bristles. He shaved them off, washed, dried and stomped off to the kitchen to find something pleasant to put in his mouth. Kettle, plug, fridge, milk, coffee, yawn. The word bulldozer wandered through his mind for a moment in search of something to connect with. The bulldozer outside the kitchen window was quite a big one. He stared at it. Yellow, he thought, and stomped off back to his bedroom to get dressed. Passing the bathroom, he stopped to drink a large glass of water and another. He began to suspect that he was hungover. Why was he hungover? Had he been drinking the night before? He supposed that he must have been. He caught a glint in the shaving mirror. Yellow, he thought, and stomped onto the bedroom. He stood and thought. The pub, he thought. Oh dear, the pub. He vaguely remembered being angry about something that seemed important. He had been telling people about it at great length, he rather suspected. His clearest visual recollection was of glazed looks on other people's faces. Something about a new bypass he'd just found out about. It had been in the pipeline for months, only no one seemed to have known about it. Ridiculous. He took a swig of water. It would sort itself out, he'd decided. No one wanted a bypass. The council didn't have a leg to stand on. It would sort itself out. God, what a terrible hangover it had earned him, though. He looked at himself in the wardrobe mirror. He stuck out his tongue. Yellow, he thought. The word yellow wandered through his mind in search of something to connect with. 15 seconds later, he was out of the house and lying in front of a big yellow bulldozer that was advancing up the garden path. Mr. L. Prosser was, as they say, only human. In other words, he was a carbon-based bipedal life form descended from an ape. More specifically, he was 40, fat and shabby and worked for the local council. Curiously enough, though he didn't know it, he was also a direct male-line descendant of Genghis Khan, though intervening generations and racial mixing had so juggled his genes that he had no discernible mongoloid characteristics, and the only vestiges left in Mr. L. Prosser of his mighty ancestry were a pronounced stoutness about the tum and a predilection for little fur hats. He was by no means a great warrior. In fact, he was a nervous, worried man. Today he was particularly nervous and worried because something had gone seriously wrong with his job, which was to see that Arthur Dent's house got cleared out of the way before the day was out. "Come off it, Mr. Dent," he said. "You can't win, you know. You can't lie in front of the bulldozer indefinitely." He tried to make his eyes blaze fiercely, but they just wouldn't do it. Arthur lay in the mud and squelched at him. "I'm game," he said. "We'll see who rusts first." "I'm afraid you're going to have to accept it," said Mr. Prosser, gripping his fur hat and rolling it round the top of his head. "This bypass has got to be built, and it's going to be built." "First I've heard of it," said Arthur. "Why's it got to be built?" Mr. Prosser shook his finger at him for a bit, then stopped and put it away again. "What do you mean, why's it got to be built?" he said. "It's a bypass. You've got to build bypasses." Bypasses are devices which allow some people to dash from point A to point B very fast, whilst other people dash from point B to point A very fast. People living at point C, being a point directly in between, are often given to wonder what's so great about point A that so many people from point B are so keen to get there, and what's so great about point B that so many people from point A are so keen to get there. They often wished that people would just once and for all work out where the hell they wanted to be. Mr. Prosser wanted to be at point D. Point D wasn't anywhere in particular, it was just any convenient point, a very long way from points A, B and C. He would have a nice little cottage at point D, with axes over the door, and spend a pleasant amount of time at point E, which would be the nearest pub to point D. His wife, of course, wanted climbing roses, but he wanted axes. He didn't know why, he just liked axes. He flushed hotly under the derisive grins of the bulldozer drivers. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, but it was equally uncomfortable on each. Obviously, somebody had been appallingly incompetent, and he hoped to God it wasn't him. Mr. Prosser said, "You are quite entitled to make any suggestions or protests at the appropriate time, you know." "Appropriate time?" hooted Arthur. "Appropriate time? The first I knew about it was when a workman arrived at my house yesterday. I asked him if he'd come to clean the windows, and he said no, he'd come to demolish the house. He didn't tell me straight away, of course. Oh, no. First he wiped a couple of windows and charged me a £5. Then he told me." "But, Mr. Dent, the plans have been available in the local planning office for the last 9 months." "Oh, yes," said Arthur. "Well, as soon as I heard, I went straight round to see them yesterday afternoon. You hadn't exactly gone out of your way to call attention to them, had you? I mean, like, actually telling anybody or anything." "But the plans are on display." "On display?" "I eventually had to go down to the cellar to find them." "Well, that's the display department." "With a torch." "Ah, well, the lights had probably gone." "So had the stairs." "But look, you found the notice, didn't you?" "Yes," said Arthur. "Yes, I did. It was on display in the bottom of a locked filing cabinet, stuck in a disused lavatory, with a sign on the door saying, 'Beware of the leopard.'" A cloud passed overhead. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent as he lay propped up on his elbow in the cold mud. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent's house. Mr. Prosser frowned at it. "It's not as if it's a particularly nice house," he said. "I'm sorry, but I happen to like it." "You like the bypass?" "Oh, shut up," said Arthur Dent. "Shut up and go away, and take your bloody bypass with you. You haven't got a leg to stand on, and you know it." Mr. Prosser's mouth opened and closed a couple of times, whilst his mind was for a moment filled with inexplicable but terribly attractive visions of Arthur Dent's house being consumed with fire, and Arthur himself running screaming from the blazing ruin with at least 3 hefty spears protruding from his back. Mr. Prosser was often bothered with visions like these, and they made him feel very nervous. He stuttered for a moment and then pulled himself together. "Mr. Dent," he said. "Hello? Yes?" said Arthur. "Some factual information for you. Have you any idea how much damage that bulldozer would suffer if I just let it roll straight over you?" "How much?" said Arthur. "None at all," said Mr. Prosser, and stormed nervously off, wondering why his brain was filled with 1,000 hairy horsemen, all shouting at him. By a curious coincidence, none at all is exactly how much suspicion the ape descendant Arthur Dent had that one of his closest friends was not descended from an ape, but was in fact from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse, and not from Guildford, as he usually claimed. Arthur Dent had never, ever suspected this. This friend of his had first arrived on the planet Earth some 15 Earth years previously, and he had worked hard to blend himself into Earth society, with, it must be said, some success. For instance, he had spent those 15 years pretending to be an out-of-work actor, which was plausible enough. He had made one careless blunder, though, because he had skimped a bit on his preparatory research. The information he had gathered had led him to choose the name Ford Prefect as being nicely inconspicuous. He was not conspicuously tall. His features were striking but not conspicuously handsome. His hair was wiry and gingerish and brushed backwards from the temples. His skin seemed to be pulled backwards from the nose. There was something very slightly odd about him, but it was difficult to say what it was. Perhaps it was that his eyes didn't seem to blink often enough, and when you talked to him for any length of time, your eyes began involuntarily to water on his behalf. Perhaps it was that he smiled slightly too broadly and gave people the unnerving impression that he was about to go for their neck. He struck most of the friends he had made on Earth as an eccentric, but a harmless one. An unruly boozer with some oddish habits. For instance, he would often gate-crash university parties, get badly drunk and start making fun of any astrophysicists he could find till he got thrown out. Sometimes he would get seized with oddly distracted moods and stare into the sky as if hypnotized until someone asked him what he was doing. Then he would start guiltily for a moment, relax and grin. "Oh, just looking for flying saucers," he would joke, and everyone would laugh and ask him what sort of flying saucers he was looking for. "Green ones," he would reply with a wicked grin, laugh wildly for a moment, and then suddenly lunge for the nearest bar and buy an enormous round of drinks. Evenings like this usually ended badly. Ford would get out of his skull on whiskey, huddle into the corner with some girl, and explain to her in slurred phrases that honestly the colour of the flying saucers didn't matter that much really. Thereafter, staggering semi-paralytic down the night streets, he would often ask passing policemen if they knew the way to Beetlejuice. The policeman would usually say something like, "Don't you think it's time you went off home, sir?" "I'm trying to, baby, I'm trying to," is what Ford invariably replied on these occasions. In fact, what he was really looking for when he stared distractedly into the sky was any kind of flying saucer at all. The reason he said green was that green was the traditional space livery of the Beetlejuice trading scouts. Ford Prefect was desperate that any flying saucer at all would arrive soon, because 15 years is a long time to get stranded anywhere, particularly somewhere as mind-bogglingly dull as the Earth. Ford wished that a flying saucer would arrive soon because he knew how to flag flying saucers down and get lifts from them. He knew how to see the marvels of the universe for less than $30 Altarian a day. In fact, Ford Prefect was a roving researcher for that wholly remarkable book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Human beings are great adapters, and by lunchtime, life in the environs of Arthur's house had settled into a steady routine. It was Arthur's accepted role to lie squelching in the mud, making occasional demands to see his lawyer, his mother, or a good book. It was Mr. Prosser's accepted role to tackle Arthur with the occasional new ploy, such as the "for the public good" talk, or the "March of Progress" talk, or the "they knocked my house down once, never look back" talk, and various other cajoleries and threats. And it was the bulldozer driver's accepted role to sit around drinking coffee and experimenting with union regulations to see how they could turn the situation to their financial advantage. The Earth moved slowly in its diurnal course. The sun was beginning to dry out the mud that Arthur lay in. A shadow moved across him again. "Hello, Arthur," said the shadow. Arthur looked up and, squinting into the sun, was startled to see Ford Prefect standing above him. "Ford! Hello, how are you?" Fine," said Ford. "Look, are you busy?" "Am I busy?" exclaimed Arthur. "Well, I've just got all these bulldozers and things to lie in front of because they'll knock my house down if I don't, but other than that, well, no, not especially. Why?" They don't have sarcasm on Beetlejuice, and Ford Prefect often failed to notice it unless he was concentrating. He said, "Good, is there anywhere we can talk?" "What?" said Arthur Dent. For a few seconds Ford seemed to ignore him, and stared fixedly into the sky like a rabbit trying to get run over by a car. Then suddenly he squatted down beside Arthur. "We've got to talk," he said, urgently. "Fine," said Arthur, "talk." "And drink," said Ford. "It's vitally important that we talk and drink. Now, we'll go to the pub in the village." He looked into the sky again, nervous, expectant. "Look, don't you understand?" shouted Arthur. He pointed at Prosser. "That man wants to knock my house down." Ford glanced at him, puzzled. "Well, he can do it while you're away, can't he asked. "But I don't want him to." "Ah. Look, what's the matter with you, Ford?" said Arthur. Nothing's the matter. Listen to me. I've got to tell you the most important thing you've ever heard. I've got to tell you now, and I've got to tell you in the saloon bar of the Horse and Groom." "But why?" "Because you're going to need a very stiff drink." Ford stared at Arthur, and Arthur was astonished to find his will beginning to weaken. He didn't realize that this was because of an old drinking game that Ford had learnt to play in the hyperspace ports that serve the Madronite mining belts in the star system of Orion Beta. The game was not unlike the Earth game called Indian wrestling, and was played like this. 2 contestants would sit either side of a table with a glass in front of each of them. Between them would be placed a bottle of Jank's spirit, as immortalized in that ancient Orion mining song, "Oh, don't give me none more of that old Jank spirit. No, don't give me none more of that old Jank spirit. For my head will fly, my tongue will lie, my eyes will fry, and I may die. Won't you pour me one more of that sinful old Jank spirit?" Each of the contestants would then concentrate their will on the bottle and attempt to tip it and pour spirit into the glass of his opponent, who would then have to drink it. The bottle would then be refilled. The game would be played again and again. Once you started to lose, you would probably keep losing, because one of the effects of Jank's spirit is to depress telepsychic power. As soon as the predetermined quantity had been consumed, the final loser would have to perform a forfeit, which was usually obscenely biological. Ford Prefect usually played to lose. Ford stared at Arthur, who began to think that perhaps he did want to go to the Horse and Groom after all. "But what about my house?" he asked plaintively. Ford looked across to Mr. Prosser, and suddenly a wicked thought struck him. "He wants to knock your house down. Yes, he wants to build, and he can't because you're lying in front of his bulldozer. Yes, and I'm sure we can come to some arrangement," said Ford. "Excuse me," he shouted. Mr. Prosser, who was arguing with a spokesman for the bulldozer drivers about whether or not Arthur Dent constituted a mental health hazard, and how much they should get paid if he did, looked around. He was surprised and slightly alarmed to see that Arthur had company. "Hello? Yes?" he called. "Has Mr. Dent come to his senses yet?" "Can we for the moment," called Ford, "assume that he hasn't?" "Well," sighed Mr. Prosser. "And can we also assume," said Ford, "that he's going to be staying here all day?" So all your men are going to be standing around all day doing nothing?" Could be. "Well, if you're resigned to doing that anyway, you don't actually need him to lie here all the time, do you?" "What?" "You don't," said Ford patiently, "actually need him here." Mr. Prosser thought about this. "Well, no, not as such," he said. "Not exactly need." Prosser was worried. He thought that one of them wasn't making a lot of sense. Ford said, "So if you'd just like to take it as read that he's actually here, then he and I could slip off down to the pub for half an hour. How does that sound?" Mr. Prosser thought it sounded perfectly potty. "That sounds perfectly reasonable," he said in a reassuring tone of voice, wondering who he was trying to reassure. "And if you want to pop off for a quick one yourself later on," said Ford, "we can always cover for you in return." "Oh, thank you very much," said Mr. Prosser, who no longer knew how to play this at all. "Thank you very much. Yes, that's very kind." He frowned, then smiled, then tried to do both at once, failed, grasped hold of his fur hat and rolled it fitfully round the top of his head. He could only assume that he had just won. "So," continued Ford Prefect, "if you'd just like to come over here and lie down—" "What?" said Mr. Prosser. "Oh, I'm sorry," said Ford. "Perhaps I hadn't made myself fully clear. Somebody's got to lie in front of the bulldozers, haven't they? Or there won't be anything to stop them driving into Mr. Dent's house, will there?" "What?" said Mr. Prosser again. "It's very simple," said Ford. "My client, Mr. Dent, says that he will stop lying here in the mud on the sole condition that you come and take over from him." "What are you talking about?" said Arthur, but Ford nudged him with his shoe to be quiet. "You want me," said Prosser, spelling out this new thought to himself, "to come and lie there?" "Yes." "In front of the bulldozer?" "Yes." "Instead of Mr. Dent?" "Yes." "In the mud?" "In, as you say, the mud." As soon as Mr. Prosser realized that he was substantially the loser after all, it was as if a weight lifted itself off his shoulders. This is more like the world as he knew it. He sighed. "In return for which, you will take Mr. Dent with you down to the pub." "That's it," said Ford. "That's it, exactly." Mr. Prosser took a few nervous steps forward and stopped. "Promise?" he said. "Promise," said Ford. He turned to Arthur. "Come on," he said to him. "Get up and let the man lie down." Arthur stood up, feeling as if he was in a dream. Ford beckoned to Prosser, who sadly, awkwardly, sat down in the mud. He felt that his whole life was some kind of dream, and he sometimes wondered whose it was and whether they were enjoying it. The mud folded itself round his bottom and his arms and oozed into his shoes. Ford looked at him severely. "And no sneaky knocking Mr. Dent's house down while he's away, all right?" he said. "The mere thought," growled Mr. Prosser, "hadn't even begun to speculate," he continued, settling himself back, "about the merest possibility of crossing my mind." He saw the bulldozer driver's union representative approaching and let his head sink back and closed his eyes. He was trying to marshal his arguments for proving that he did not now constitute a mental health hazard himself. He was far from certain about this. His mind seemed to be full of noise, horses, smoke, and the stench of blood. This always happened when he felt miserable or put upon, and he had never been able to explain it to himself. In a high dimension of which we know nothing, the mighty Khan bellowed with rage, but Mr. Prosser only trembled slightly and whimpered. He began to feel little pricks of water behind his eyelids. Bureaucratic cock-ups, angry men lying in mud, indecipherable strangers handing out inexplicable humiliations, and an unidentified army of horsemen laughing at him in his head. What a day! What a day! Ford Prefect knew that it didn't matter a pair of dingo's kidneys whether Arthur's house got knocked down or not now. Arthur remained very worried. "But can we trust him?" he said. "Myself, I'd trust him to the end of the earth," said Ford. "Oh yes," said Arthur, "and how far's that?" "About 12 minutes away," said Ford. "Come on, I need a drink." Chapter 2. Here's what the Encyclopedia Galactica has to say about alcohol. It says that alcohol is a colourless, volatile liquid formed by the fermentation of sugars, and also notes its intoxicating effect on certain carbon-based life forms. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy also mentions alcohol. It says that the best drink in existence is the Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster. It says that the effect of drinking a Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster is like having your brain smashed out by a slice of lemon wrapped round a large gold brick. The guide also tells you on which planets the best Pan-Galactic Gargle Blasters are mixed, how much you can expect to pay for one, and what voluntary organizations exist to help you rehabilitate afterwards. The guide even tells you how you can mix one yourself. Take the juice from one bottle of that old jank spirit, it says. Pour into it 1 measure of water from the seas of Santraginus 5. Oh, that Santraginian seawater, it says. Oh, those Santraginian fish. Allow 3 cubes of Arcturan Megagin to melt into the mixture. It must be properly iced or the benzene is lost. Allow 4 litres of Phalian marsh gas to bubble through it, in memory of all those happy hikers who have died of pleasure in the marshes of Phalia. Over the back of a silver spoon float a measure of qualactin hypermint extract, redolent of all the heady odours of the dark qualactin zones, subtle, sweet and mystic. Drop in the tooth of an Algolian sun tiger. Watch it dissolve, spreading the fires of the Algolian suns deep into the heart of the drink. Sprinkle zamphor. Add an olive. Drink, but very carefully. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy sells rather better than the Encyclopedia Galactica. 6 pints of bitter, said Ford Prefect to the barman of the Horse and Groom, and quickly please, the world's about to end. The barman of the Horse and Groom didn't deserve this sort of treatment. He was a dignified old man. He pushed his glasses up his nose and blinked at Ford Prefect. Ford ignored him and stared out of the window, so the barman looked instead at Arthur, who shrugged helplessly and said nothing. So the barman said, "Oh yes, sir, nice weather for it," and started pulling pints. He tried again. "Gonna watch the match this afternoon, then?" Ford glanced round at him. No point," he said, and looked back out of the window. "What's that, foregone conclusion then, you reckon, sir?" said the barman. "Arsenal without a chance?" No, said Ford. It's just that the world's about to end. Oh, yes, sir, so you said the barman, looking over his glasses, this time at Arthur. Lucky escape for Arsenal if it did. Ford looked back at him, genuinely surprised. No, not really, he said. He frowned. The barman breathed in heavily. There you are, sir, 6 pints, he said. Arthur smiled at him wanly and shrugged again. He turned and smiled wanly at the rest of the pub, just in case any of them had heard what was going on. None of them had, and none of them could understand what he was smiling at them for. A man sitting next to Ford at the bar looked at the 2 men, looked at the 6 pints, did a swift burst of mental arithmetic, arrived at an answer he liked, and grinned a stupid, hopeful grin at them. Get off, said Ford, they're ours, giving him a look that would have made an Algolian sun tiger get on with what it was doing. Ford slapped a £10 note on the bar. He said, keep the change. What, from a tenner? Thank you, sir. You've got 10 minutes left to spend it. The barman decided simply to walk away for a bit. Ford, said Arthur, would you please tell me what the hell is going on? Drink up, said Ford, you've got 3 pints to get through. 3 pints, said Arthur, at lunchtime? The man next to Ford grinned and nodded happily. Ford ignored him. He said, time is an illusion, lunchtime doubly so. Oh, very deep, said Arthur. You should send that into the Reader's Digest. They've got a page for people like you. Drink up. Why 3 pints all of a sudden? Muscle relaxant, you'll need it. Muscle relaxant? A muscle relaxant. Arthur stared into his beer. Did I do anything wrong today, he said. Or has the world always been like this and I've been too wrapped up in myself to notice? All right, said Ford, I'll try to explain. Now, how long have we known each other? How long? Arthur thought, about 5 years, maybe 6. Most of it seemed to make some kind of sense at the time. All right, said Ford. How would you react if I said that I'm not from Guildford after all, but from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Beetlejuice? Arthur shrugged in a so-so sort of way. I don't know, he said, taking a pull of beer. Why, do you think it's the sort of thing you're likely to say? Ford gave up. It really wasn't worth bothering at the moment, what with the world being about to end. He just said, drink up. He added, perfectly factually, the world's about to end. Arthur gave the rest of the pub another wan smile. The rest of the pub frowned at him. A man waved at him to stop smiling at them and mind his own business. This must be Thursday, said Arthur to himself, sinking low over his beer. I never could get the hang of Thursdays. Chapter 3. On this particular Thursday, something was moving quietly through the ionosphere many miles above the surface of the planet. Several somethings, in fact. Several dozen huge, yellow, chunky, slab-like somethings, huge as office blocks, silent as birds. They soared with ease, basking in electromagnetic rays from the star Sol, biding their time, grouping, preparing. The planet beneath them was almost perfectly oblivious of their presence, which was just how they wanted it for the moment. The huge yellow somethings went unnoticed at Goonhilly. They passed over Cape Canaveral without a blip. Woomera and Jodrell Bank looked straight through them, which was a pity because it was exactly the sort of thing they'd been looking for all these years. The only place they registered at all was on a small black device called a sub-ether sensormatic, which winked away quietly to itself. It nestled in the darkness inside a leather satchel which Ford Prefect habitually wore slung around his neck. The contents of Ford Prefect's satchel were quite interesting, in fact, and would have made any Earth physicist's eyes pop out of his head, which is why he always concealed them by keeping a couple of dog-eared scripts for plays he pretended he was auditioning for stuffed in the top. Besides the sub-ether sensormatic and the scripts, he had an electronic thumb, a short, squat, black rod, smooth and matte, with a couple of flat switches and dials at one end. He also had a device which looked rather like a largish electronic calculator. This had about 100 tiny flat press buttons, and a screen about 4 inches square on which any one of 1,000,000 pages could be summoned at a moment's notice. It looked insanely complicated, and this is one of the reasons why the slug plastic cover it fitted into had the words "Don't Panic" printed on it in large, friendly letters. The other reason was that this device was in fact that most remarkable of all books ever to come out of the great publishing corporations of Ursa Minor, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The reason why it was published in the form of a micro-sub-meson electronic component is that if it were printed in normal book form, an interstellar hitchhiker would require several inconveniently large buildings to carry it around in. Beneath that, in Ford Prefect's satchel, were a few ball pens, a notepad, and a largish bath towel from Marks & Spencer. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy has a few things to say on the subject of towels. A towel, it says, is about the most massively useful thing an interstellar hitchhiker can have. Partly, it has great practical value. You can wrap it around yourself for warmth as you bound across the cold moons of Jaglin Beta. You can lie on it on the brilliant marble-sanded beaches of Santraginus V, inhaling the heady sea vapours. You can sleep under it beneath the stars which shine so redly on the desert world of Kakrafoon. Use it to sail a mini-raft down the slow, heavy river Moth. Wet it for use in hand-to-hand combat. Wrap it round your head to ward off noxious fumes, or avoid the gaze of the ravenous bug-bladder beast of Trull, a mind-bogglingly stupid animal. It assumes that if you can't see it, it can't see you. Daft as a brush, but very, very ravenous. You can wave your towel in emergencies as a distress signal. And, of course, dry yourself off with it, if it still seems to be clean enough. More importantly, a towel has immense psychological value. For some reason, if a strag means non-hitchhiker, discovers that a hitchhiker has his towel with him, he will automatically assume that he is also in possession of a toothbrush, face flannel, soap, tin of biscuits, flask, compass, map, ball of string, gnat spray, wet weather gear, spacesuit, etc., etc. Furthermore, the strag will then happily lend the hitchhiker any of these or a dozen other items that the hitchhiker might accidentally have lost. What the strag will think is that any man who can hitch the length and breadth of the galaxy, rough it, slum it, struggle against terrible odds, win through, and still know where his towel is clearly a man to be reckoned with. Hence a phrase which has passed into hitchhiking slang, as in, "Hey, you sass that hoopy, Ford Prefect? There's a frood who really knows where his towel is." Sass means know, be aware of, meet, have sex with. Hoopy means really together guy. Frood means really amazingly together guy. Nestling quietly on top of the towel in Ford Prefect's satchel, the sub-ether sensomatic began to wink more quickly. Miles above the surface of the planet, the huge yellow somethings began to fan out. At Jodrell Bank, someone decided it was time for a nice, relaxing cup of tea. "You got a towel with you?" said Ford suddenly to Arthur. Arthur, struggling through his third pint, looked around at him. "Why? What? No, should I have?" He had given up being surprised. There didn't seem to be any point any longer. Ford clicked his tongue in irritation. "Drink up," he urged. At that moment, the dull sound of a rumbling crash from outside filtered through the low murmur of the pub, through the sound of the jukebox, through the sound of the man next to Ford hiccuping over the whiskey Ford had eventually bought him. Arthur choked on his beer and leapt to his feet. "What's that?" he yelped. "Don't worry," said Ford. "They haven't started yet." "Oh, thank God for that," said Arthur, and relaxed. "It's probably just your house being knocked down," said Ford, downing his last pint. "What?" shouted Arthur. Suddenly Ford's spell was broken. Arthur looked wildly around him and ran to the window. "My God, they are! They're knocking my house down! What the hell am I doing in the pub, Ford?" "Hardly makes any difference at this stage," said Ford. "Let them have their fun." "Fun?" yelped Arthur. "Fun?" He quickly checked out of the window again that they were talking about the same thing. "Damn their fun!" he hooted, and ran out of the pub, furiously waving a nearly empty beer glass. He made no friends at all in the pub that lunchtime. "Stop, you vandals, you homewreckers!" bawled Arthur. "You half-crazed visigoths, stop, will you?" Ford would have to go after him. Turning quickly to the barman, he asked for 4 packets of peanuts. "There you are, sir," said the barman, slapping the packets on the bar. "It's £1.60, if you'd be so kind." Ford was very kind. He gave the barman another £10 note and told him to keep the change. The barman looked at it and then looked at Ford. He suddenly shivered. He experienced a momentary sensation that he didn't understand, because no one on Earth had ever experienced it before. In moments of great stress, every life form that exists gives out a tiny subliminal signal. This signal simply communicates an exact and almost pathetic sense of how far that being is from the place of his birth. On Earth, it is never possible to be further than 16,000 miles from your birthplace, which isn't really very far. So such signals are too minute to be noticed. Ford Prefect was, at this moment, under great stress, and he was born 600 light-years away in the near vicinity of Betelgeuse. The barman reeled for a moment, hit by a shocking, incomprehensible sense of distance. He didn't know what it meant, but he looked at Ford Prefect with a new sense of respect, almost awe. "Are you serious, sir?" he said in a small whisper which had the effect of silencing the pub. "You think the world's going to end?" "Yes," said Ford. "But this afternoon?" Ford had recovered himself. He was at his flippest. "Yes," he said gaily, "in less than 2 minutes, I would estimate." The barman couldn't believe this conversation he was having, but he couldn't believe the sensation he had just had either. "Isn't there anything we can do about it then?" he said. "No, nothing," said Ford, stuffing the peanuts into his pocket. Someone in the hush bar suddenly laughed raucously at how stupid everyone had become. The man sitting next to Ford was a bit sozzled by now. His eyes weaved their way up to Ford. "I thought," he said, "that if the world was going to end, we were meant to lie down or put a paper bag over our head or something." "If you like, yes," said Ford. "That's what they told us in the army," said the man, and his eyes began the long trek back towards his whiskey. "Will that help?" asked the barman. "No," said Ford, and gave him a friendly smile. "Excuse me," he said, "I've got to go." With a wave, he left. The pub was silent for a moment longer, and then, embarrassingly enough, the man with the raucous laugh did it again. The girl he had dragged along to the pub with him had grown to loathe him dearly over the last hour, and it would probably have been a great satisfaction to her to know that in a minute and a half or so he would suddenly evaporate into a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. However, when the moment came, she would be too busy evaporating herself to notice it. The barman cleared his throat. He heard himself say, "Last orders, please." The huge yellow machines began to sink downwards and to move faster. Ford knew they were there. This wasn't the way he had wanted it. Running up the lane, Arthur had nearly reached his house. He didn't notice how cold it had suddenly become. He didn't notice the wind. He didn't notice the sudden irrational squall of rain. He didn't notice anything but the caterpillar bulldozers crawling over the rubble that had been his home. "You barbarians!" he yelled. "I'll sue the council for every penny it's got. I'll have you hung, drawn and quartered, and whipped, and boiled, until you've had enough." Ford was running after him, very fast, very, very fast. "And then I'll do it again," yelled Arthur. "And when I've finished, I will take all the bits, and I will jump on them." Arthur didn't notice that the men were running from the bulldozers. He didn't notice that Mr. Prosser was staring hectically into the sky. What Mr. Prosser had noticed was that huge yellow somethings were screaming through the clouds, impossibly huge yellow somethings. "And I will carry on jumping on them," yelled Arthur, still running, "until I get blisters, or I can think of anything even more unpleasant to do, and then—" Arthur tripped and fell headlong, rolled and landed flat on his back. At last he noticed that something was going on. His finger shot upwards. "What the hell's that?" he shrieked. Whatever it was raced across the sky in its monstrous yellowness, tore the sky apart with mind-buggering noise, and leapt off into the distance, leaving the gaping air to shut behind it with a bang that drove your ears 6 feet into your skull. Another one followed and did exactly the same thing, only louder. It's difficult to say exactly what the people on the surface of the planet were doing now, because they didn't really know what they were doing themselves. None of it made a lot of sense. Running into houses, running out of houses, howling noiselessly at the noise. All around the world, city streets exploded with people. Cars slewed into each other as the noise fell on them, and then rolled off like a tidal wave over hills and valleys, deserts and oceans, seeming to flatten everything it hit. Only one man stood and watched the sky, stood with terrible sadness in his eyes and rubber bungs in his ears. He knew exactly what was happening, and had known ever since his sub-ether sensomatic had started winking in the dead of night beside his pillow and woken him with a start. It was what he had waited for all these years, but when he had deciphered the signal pattern, sitting alone in his small, dark room, a coldness had gripped him and squeezed his heart. Of all the races in all of the galaxy who could have come and said a big hello to planet Earth, he thought, didn't it just have to be the Vogons? Still, he knew what he had to do. As the Vogon craft screamed through the air high above him, he opened his satchel. He threw away a copy of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. He threw away a copy of Godspell. He wouldn't need them where he was going. Everything was ready. Everything was prepared. He knew where his towel was. A sudden silence hit the earth. If anything, it was worse than the noise. For a while, nothing happened. The great ships hung motionless in the sky over every nation on Earth. Motionless they hung, huge, heavy, steady in the sky, a blasphemy against nature. Many people went straight into shock as their minds tried to encompass what they were looking at. The ships hung in the sky in much the same way that bricks don't. And still, nothing happened. Then there was a slight whisper, a sudden spacious whisper of open, ambient sound. Every hi-fi set in the world, every radio, every television, every cassette recorder, every woofer, every tweeter, every mid-range driver in the world quietly turned itself on. Every tin can, every dustbin, every window, every car, every wine glass, every sheet of rusty metal became activated as an acoustically perfect sounding board. Before the Earth passed away, it was going to be treated to the very ultimate in sound reproduction, the greatest public address system ever built. But there was no concert, no music, no fanfare, just a simple message. "People of Earth, your attention please," a voice said. And it was wonderful. Wonderful, perfect, quadraphonic sound at distortion levels so low as to make a brave man weep. "This is Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz of the Galactic Hyperspace Planning Council," the voice continued. "As you will no doubt be aware, the plans for development of the outlying regions of the galaxy require the building of a hyperspatial express route through your star system. And regrettably, your planet is one of those scheduled for demolition. The process will take slightly less than 2 of your Earth minutes. Thank you." The PA died away. Uncomprehending terror settled on the watching people of Earth. The terror moved slowly through the gathered crowds as if they were iron filings on a sheet of board and a magnet was moving beneath them. Panic sprouted again, desperate, fleeing panic. But there was nowhere to flee to. Observing this, the Vogons turned on their PA again. It said, "There's no point in acting all surprised about it. All the planning charts and demolition orders have been on display in your local planning department in Alpha Centauri for 50 of your Earth years, so you've had plenty of time to lodge any formal complaint, and it's far too late to start making a fuss about it now." The PA fell silent again, and its echo drifted off across the land. The huge ships turned slowly in the sky with easy power. On the underside of each, a hatchway opened, an empty black square. By this time, somebody somewhere must have manned a radio transmitter, located a wavelength, and broadcast a message back to the Vogon ships to plead on behalf of the planet. Nobody ever heard what they said. They only heard the reply. The PA slammed back into life again. The voice was annoyed. It said, "What do you mean you've never been to Alpha Centauri? For heaven's sake, mankind, it's only 4 light years away, you know. I'm sorry, but if you can't be bothered to take an interest in local affairs, that's your own lookout." Energize the demolition beams! Light poured out of the hatchways. I don't know, said the voice on the PA. Apathetic bloody planet and no sympathy at all. It cut off. There was a terrible, ghastly silence. There was a terrible, ghastly noise. There was a terrible, ghastly silence. The Vogon constructor fleet coasted away into the inky, starry void. Chapter 4. Far away on the opposite spiral arm of the galaxy, 500,000 light-years from the star Sol, Zaphod Beeblebrox, president of the Imperial Galactic Government, sped across the seas of Damagran, his iron drive delta boat winking and flashing in the Damagran sun. Damagran the hot, Damagran the remote, Damagran the almost totally unheard of, Damagran, secret home of the Heart of Gold. The boat sped on across the water. It would be some time before it reached its destination because Damagran is such an inconveniently arranged planet. It consists of nothing but middling to large desert islands separated by very pretty but annoyingly wide stretches of ocean. The boat sped on. Because of this topographical awkwardness, Damagran has always remained a deserted planet. This is why the Imperial Galactic Government chose Damagran for the Heart of Gold project, because it was so deserted, and the Heart of Gold project was so secret. The boat zipped and skipped across the sea that lay between the main islands of the only archipelago of any useful size on the whole planet. Zaphod Beeblebrox was on his way from the tiny spaceport on Easter Island. The name was an entirely meaningless coincidence. In galactic speak, Easter means small, flat and light brown. To the Heart of Gold Island, which by another meaningless coincidence was called France. One of the side effects of work on the Heart of Gold was a whole string of petty, meaningless coincidences. But it was not in any way a coincidence that today, the day of culmination of the project, the great day of unveiling, the day that the Heart of Gold was finally to be introduced to a marvelling galaxy, was also a great day of culmination for Zaphod Beeblebrox. It was for the sake of this day that he had first decided to run for the presidency, a decision which had sent shockwaves of astonishment throughout the Imperial Galaxy. Zaphod Beeblebrox? President? Not the Zaphod Beeblebrox. I mean, not the president. Many had seen it as clinching proof that the whole of known creation had finally gone bananas. Zaphod grinned and gave the boat an extra kick of speed. Zaphod Beeblebrox, adventurer, ex-hippie, good-timer, crook, quite possibly, manic self-publicist, terribly bad at personal relationships, often thought to be completely out to lunch. President. The full title is President of the Imperial Galactic Government. The term Imperial is kept, though it is now an anachronism. The hereditary emperor is nearly dead, and has been for many centuries. In the last moments of his dying coma, he was locked in a stasis field which keeps him in a state of perpetual unchangingness. All his heirs are now long dead, and this means that without any drastic political upheaval, power has simply and effectively moved a rung or two down the ladder, and is now seen to be vested in a body which used to act simply as advisors to the emperor, an elected government assembly headed by a president elected by that assembly. In fact, it vests in no such place. The president in particular is very much a figurehead. He wields no real power whatsoever. He is apparently chosen by the government, but the qualities he is required to display are not those of leadership, but of finely judged outrage. For this reason, the president is always a controversial choice, always an infuriating but fascinating character. His job is not to wield power, but to draw attention away from it. On those criteria, Zaphod Beeblebrox is one of the most successful presidents the galaxy has ever had. He has already spent 2 of his 10 presidential years in prison for fraud. Very, very few people realize that the president and the government have virtually no power at all. And of these few people, only 6 know whence ultimate political power is wielded. Most of the others secretly believe that the ultimate decision-making process is handled by a computer. They couldn't be more wrong. No one had gone bananas. Not in that way, at least. Only 6 people in the entire galaxy understood the principle on which the galaxy was governed, and they knew that once Zaphod Beeblebrox had announced his intention to run as president, it was more or less a fait accompli. He was ideal presidency fodder. What they completely failed to understand was why Zaphod was doing it. He banked sharply, shooting a wild wall of water at the sun. Today was the day. Today was the day when they would realize what Zaphod had been up to. Today was what Zaphod Beeblebrox's presidency was all about. Today was also his 200th birthday, but that was just another meaningless coincidence. As he skipped his boat across the seas of Damagran, he smiled quietly to himself about what a wonderful, exciting day it was going to be. He relaxed and spread his 2 arms lazily along the seat back. He steered with an extra arm he'd recently had fitted just beneath his right one to help improve his ski boxing. "Hey," he cooed to himself, "you're a real cool boy, you." But his nerves sang a song shriller than a dog whistle. The island of France was about 20 miles long, 5 miles across the middle, sandy and crescent-shaped. In fact, it seemed to exist not so much as an island in its own right, as simply a means of defining the sweep and curve of a huge bay. This impression was heightened by the fact that the inner coastline of the crescent consisted almost entirely of steep cliffs. From the top of the cliff, the land sloped slowly down 5 miles to the opposite shore. On top of the cliffs stood a reception committee. It consisted in large part of the engineers and researchers who had built the Heart of Gold, mostly humanoid, but here and there were a few reptiloid atomineers, 2 or 3 green sylph-like maxi-megalithicians, an octopodic physacualist or 2, and a hulavu. A hulavu is a super-intelligent shade of the colour blue. All except the hulavu were resplendent in their multicolored ceremonial lab coats. The hulavu had been temporarily refracted into a freestanding prism for the occasion. There was a mood of immense excitement thrilling through them all. Together and between them they'd gone to and beyond the furthest limits of physical laws, restructured the fundamental fabric of matter, strained, twisted and broken the laws of possibility and impossibility, but still the greatest excitement of all seemed to be to meet a man with an orange sash round his neck. An orange sash was what the President of the Galaxy traditionally wore. It might not even have made much difference to them if they'd known exactly how much power the President of the Galaxy actually wielded. None at all. Only 6 people in the galaxy knew that the job of the Galactic President was not to wield power, but to attract attention away from it. Zaphod Beeblebrox was amazingly good at his job. The crowd gasped, dazzled by sun and seamanship, as the presidential speedboat zipped round the headland into the bay. It flashed and shone as it came skating over the sea in wide, skidding turns. In fact, it didn't need to touch the water at all, because it was supported on a hazy cushion of ionized atoms, but just for effect it was fitted with thin fin blades which could be lowered into the water. They slashed sheets of water hissing into the air, carved deep gashes in the sea, which swayed crazily and sank back foaming in the boat's wake as it careered across the bay. Zaphod loved effect. It was what he was best at. He twisted the wheel sharply. The boat slewed round in a wild, scything skid beneath the cliff face and dropped to rest lightly on the rocking waves. Within seconds he was out onto the deck and waved and grinned at over 3 billion people. The 3 billion people weren't actually there, but they watched his every gesture through the eyes of a small robot Tri-D camera which hovered obsequiously in the air nearby. The antics of the president always made amazingly popular Tri-D. That's what they were for. He grinned again. 3,000,006,000 people didn't know it, but today would be a bigger antic than anyone had bargained for. The robot camera moved in for a close-up on the more popular of his 2 heads, and he waved again. He was roughly humanoid in appearance, except for the extra head and 3rd arm. His fair, tousled hair stuck out in random directions, his blue eyes glinted with something completely unidentifiable, and his chins were almost always unshaven. A 20-foot-high, transparent globe floated next to his boat, rolling and bobbing, glistening in the brilliant sun. Inside it floated a wide, semicircular sofa, upholstered in glorious red leather. The more the globe bobbed and rolled, the more the sofa stayed perfectly still, steady as an upholstered rock. Again, all done for effect as much as anything. Zaphod stepped through the wall of the globe and relaxed on the sofa. He spread his two arms along the back and with the third brushed some dust off his knee. His head looked about, smiling. He put his feet up. At any moment, he thought, he might scream. Water boiled up beneath the bubble. It seethed and spouted. The bubbles surged into the air, bobbing and rolling on the waterspout. Up it climbed, throwing stilts of light at the cliff. Up it surged on the jet, the water falling from beneath it, crashing back into the sea hundreds of feet below. Zaphod smiled, picturing himself. A thoroughly ridiculous form of transport, but a thoroughly beautiful one. At the top of the cliff, the globe wavered for a moment, tipped onto a railed ramp, rolled down it to a small concave platform, and riddled to a halt. To tremendous applause, Zaphod Beeblebrox stepped out of the bubble, his orange sash blazing in the light. The President of the Galaxy had arrived. He waited for the applause to die down, then raised his hand in greeting. "Hi," he said. A government spider sidled up to him and attempted to press a copy of his prepared speech into his hands. Pages 3 to 7 of the original version were at that moment floating soggily on the Damagran Sea some 5 miles out from the bay. Pages 1 and 2 had been salvaged by a Damagran frond-crested eagle and had already become incorporated into an extraordinary new form of nest which the eagle had invented. It was constructed largely of papier-mâché, and it was virtually impossible for a newly hatched baby eagle to break out of it. The Damagran frond-crested eagle had heard of the notion of the survival of the species, but wanted no truck with it. Zaphod Beeblebrox would not be needing his set speech, and he gently deflected the one being offered him by the spider. "Hi," he said again. Everyone beamed at him, or at least nearly everyone. He singled out Trillian from the crowd. Trillian was a girl that Zaphod had picked up recently while visiting a planet, just for fun, incognito. She was slim, darkish, humanoid, with long waves of black hair, a full mouth, an odd little knob of a nose, and ridiculously brown eyes. With her red headscarf knotted in that particular way, and her long, flowing, silky brown dress, she looked vaguely Arabic. Not that anyone there had ever heard of an Arab, of course. The Arabs had very recently ceased to exist, and even when they had existed, they were 500,000 light-years from Damagran. Trillian wasn't anybody in particular, or so Zaphod claimed. She just went around with him rather a lot and told him what she thought of him. "Hi, honey," he said to her. She flashed him a quick, tight smile and looked away. Then she looked back for a moment and smiled more warmly, but by this time he was looking at something else. "Hi," he said to a small knot of creatures from the press who were standing nearby, wishing that he would stop saying hi and get on with the quotes. He grinned at them particularly because he knew that in a few moments he would be giving them one hell of a quote. The next thing he said, though, was not a lot of use to them. One of the officials of the party had irritably decided that the president was clearly not in the mood to read the deliciously turned speech that had been written for him, and had flipped the switch on the remote control device in his pocket. Away in front of them, a huge white dome that bulged against the sky cracked down the middle, split, and slowly folded itself down into the ground. Everyone gasped, although they had known perfectly well it was going to do that, because they had built it that way. Beneath it lay uncovered a huge starship, 150 meters long, shaped like a sleek running shoe, perfectly white and mind-bogglingly beautiful. At the heart of it, unseen, lay a small gold box, which carried within it the most brain-wrenching device ever conceived, a device which made this starship unique in the history of the galaxy, a device after which the ship had been named, the Heart of Gold. "Wow," said Zaphod Beeblebrox to the Heart of Gold. There wasn't much else he could say. He said it again because he knew it would annoy the press. "Wow." The crowd turned their faces back towards him expectantly. He winked at Trillian, who raised her eyebrows and widened her eyes at him. She knew what he was about to say and thought him a terrible show-off. "That is really amazing," he said. That really is truly amazing. That is so amazingly amazing, I think I'd like to steal it. A marvellous presidential quote, absolutely true to form. The crowd laughed appreciatively, the newsmen gleefully punched buttons on their sub-ether newsmatics, and the president grinned. As he grinned, his heart screamed unbearably, and he fingered the small paralyzomatic bomb that nestled quietly in his pocket. Finally, he could bear it no more. He lifted his heads up to the sky, let out a wild whoop in major thirds, threw the bomb to the ground, and ran forward through the sea of suddenly frozen, beaming smiles. Chapter 5. Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz was not a pleasant sight, even for other Vogons. His highly domed nose rose high above a small piggy forehead. His dark green rubbery skin was thick enough for him to play the game of Vogon civil service politics and play it well, and waterproof enough for him to survive indefinitely at sea depths of up to 1,000 feet with no ill effects. Not that he ever went swimming, of course. His busy schedule would not allow it. He was the way he was because billions of years ago, when the Vogons had first crawled out of the sluggish primeval seas of Vogsphere and lain panting and heaving on the planet's virgin shores, when the first rays of the bright young Vogsol sun had shone across them that morning, it was as if the forces of evolution had simply given up on them there and then, had turned aside in disgust and written them off as an ugly and unfortunate mistake. They never evolved again. They should never have survived. The fact that they did is some kind of tribute to the thick-willed, slug-brained stubbornness of these creatures. Evolution, they said to themselves, who needs it? And what nature refused to do for them, they simply did without, until such time as they were able to rectify the grosser anatomical inconveniences with surgery. Meanwhile, the natural forces on the planet Vogsphere had been working overtime to make up for their earlier blunder. They brought forth scintillating jewel scuttling crabs, which the Vogons ate, smashing their shells with iron mallets. Tall, aspiring trees of breathtaking slenderness and colour, which the Vogons cut down and burnt the crab meat with. Elegant, gazelle-like creatures with silken coats and dewy eyes, which the Vogons would catch and sit on. They were no use as transport, because their backs would snap instantly, but the Vogons sat on them anyway. Thus the planet Vogsphere whiled away the unhappy millennia until the Vogons suddenly discovered the principles of interstellar travel. Within a few short Vog years, every last Vogon had migrated to the Megabrantis cluster, the political hub of the galaxy, and they now formed the immensely powerful backbone of the galactic civil service. They have attempted to acquire learning, they have attempted to acquire style and social grace, but in most respects the modern Vogon is little different from his primitive forebears. Every year they import 27,000 scintillating jewel scuttling crabs from their native planet, and while away a happy drunken night, smashing them to bits with iron mallets. Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz was a fairly typical Vogon in that he was thoroughly vile. Also, he did not like hitchhikers. Somewhere in a small, dark cabin, buried deep in the intestines of Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz's flagship, a small match flared nervously. The owner of the match was not a Vogon, but he knew all about them, and he was right to be nervous. His name was Ford Prefect. Ford Prefect's original name is only pronounceable in an obscure Betelgeusian dialect, now virtually extinct since the great collapsing Hurung disaster of galactic sidereal year 03758, which wiped out all the old Praxi-Beetle communities on Betelgeuse 7. Ford's father was the only man on the entire planet to survive the great collapsing Hurung disaster, by an extraordinary coincidence that he was never able satisfactorily to explain. The whole episode is shrouded in deep mystery. In fact, no one ever knew what a Hurung was, nor why it had chosen to collapse on Betelgeuse 7 particularly. Ford's father, magnanimously waving aside the clouds of suspicion that had inevitably settled around him, came to live on Betelgeuse 5, where he both fathered and uncled Ford. In memory of his now dead race, he christened him in the ancient Praxi Beetle tongue. Because Ford never learnt to say his original name, his father eventually died of shame, which is still a terminal disease in some parts of the galaxy. The other kids at school nicknamed him Ix, which in the language of Beetlejuice 5 translates as boy who is not able satisfactorily to explain what a hrung is, nor why it should choose to collapse on Beetlejuice 7. Ford looked about the cabin, but could see very little. Strange monstrous shadows loomed and leaped with the tiny flickering flame, but all was quiet. He breathed a silent thank you to the Dentrosses. The Dentrosses are an unruly tribe of gourmands, a wild but pleasant bunch, whom the Vogons had recently taken to employing as catering staff on their long-haul fleets, on the strict understanding that they keep themselves very much to themselves. This suited the Dentrosses fine, because they loved Vogon money, which is one of the hardest currencies in space, but loathed the Vogons themselves. The only sort of Vogon a Dentrossi liked to see was an annoyed Vogon. It was because of this tiny piece of information that Ford Prefect was not now a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. He heard a slight groan. By the light of the match, he saw a heavy shape moving slightly on the floor. Quickly, he took the match out, reached in his pocket, found what he was looking for, and took it out. He ripped it open and shook it. He crouched on the floor. The shape moved again. Ford Prefect said, "I bought some peanuts." Arthur Dent moved and groaned again, muttering incoherently. "Here, have some," urged Ford, shaking the packet again. "If you've never been through a matter transference beam before, you've probably lost some salt and protein. The beer you had should have cushioned your system a bit." Said Arthur Dent. He opened his eyes. "It's dark," he said. "Yes," said Ford Prefect. "It's dark." "No light," said Arthur Dent. "Dark, no light." One of the things Ford Prefect had always found hardest to understand about humans was their habit of continually stating and repeating the very, very obvious, as in, "It's a nice day," or "You're very tall," or "Oh dear, you seem to have fallen down a 30-foot well. Are you all right?" At first, Ford had formed a theory to account for this strange behaviour. If human beings don't keep exercising their lips, he thought, their mouths probably seize up. After a few months' consideration and observation, he abandoned this theory in favour of a new one. If they don't keep on exercising their lips, he thought, their brains start working. After a while he abandoned this one as well, as being obstructively cynical, and decided he quite liked human beings after all, but he always remained desperately worried about the terrible number of things they didn't know about. "Yes," he agreed with Arthur, "no light." He helped Arthur to some peanuts. "How do you feel?" he asked him. "Like a military academy," said Arthur. "Bits of me keep on passing out." Ford stared at him blankly in the darkness. "If I asked you where the hell we were," said Arthur weakly, "would I regret it?" Ford stood up. "We're safe," he said. "Oh, good," said Arthur. "We're in a small galley cabin," said Ford, "in one of the spaceships of the Vogon constructor fleet." "Ah," said Arthur. This is obviously some strange usage of the word safe that I wasn't previously aware of." Ford struck another match to help him search for a light switch. Monstrous shadows leaped and loomed again. Arthur struggled to his feet and hugged himself apprehensively. Hideous alien shapes seemed to throng about him. The air was thick with musty smells which sidled into his lungs without identifying themselves, and a low, irritating hum kept his brain from focusing. "How did we get here?" he asked, shivering slightly. "We hitched a lift," said Ford. "Excuse me," said Arthur. "Are you trying to tell me that we just stuck out our thumbs and some green bug-eyed monster stuck his head out and said, 'Hi fellas, hop right in, I can take you as far as the Basingstoke roundabout'?" "Well," said Ford, "the thumb's an electronic sub-ether signalling device. The roundabout's at Barnard's Star, 6 light-years away, but otherwise that's more or less right." And the bug-eyed monster? Is green, yes. Fine, said Arthur. When can I go home? You can't, said Ford Prefect, and found the light switch. Shade your eyes, he said, and turned it on. Even Ford was surprised. Good grief, said Arthur. Is this really the interior of a flying saucer? Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz heaved his unpleasant green body round the control bridge. He always felt vaguely irritable after demolishing populated planets. He wished that someone would come and tell him it was all wrong so he could shout at them and feel better. He flopped as heavily as he could onto his control seat in the hope that it would break and give him something to be genuinely angry about. But it only gave a complaining sort of creak. Go away! He shouted at a young Vogon guard who entered the bridge at that moment. The guard vanished immediately, feeling rather relieved. He was glad it wouldn't now be him who delivered the report they'd just received. The report was an official release, which said that a wonderful new form of spaceship drive was at this moment being unveiled at a government research base on Damagran, which would henceforth make all hyperspatial express routes unnecessary. Another door slid open, but this time the Vogon captain didn't shout, because it was the door from the galley quarters, where the Dantrassis prepared his meals. A meal would be most welcome. A huge furry creature bounded through the door with his lunch tray. It was grinning like a maniac. Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz was delighted. He knew that when a Dantrassi looked that pleased with itself, there was something going on somewhere on the ship that he could get very angry about indeed. Ford and Arthur stared around them. Well, what do you think? Said Ford. It's a bit squalid, isn't it? Ford frowned at the grubby mattresses, unwashed cups, and unidentifiable bits of smelly alien underwear that lay around the cramped cabin. Well, this is a working ship, you see, said Ford. These are Dantrassi sleeping quarters. I thought you said they were called Vogons or something, said Arthur. Yes, said Ford. The Vogons are on the ship, the Dantrassis are the cooks. They let us on board. I'm confused, said Arthur. Here, have a look at this, said Ford. He sat down on one of the mattresses and rummaged about in his satchel. Arthur prodded the mattress nervously and then sat on it himself. In fact, he had very little to be nervous about, because all mattresses grown in the swamps of Squanchula Zeta are very thoroughly killed and dried before being put to service. Very few have ever come to life again. Ford handed the book to Arthur. What is it? Asked Arthur. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's a sort of electronic book. It tells you everything you need to know about anything. That's its job. Arthur turned it over nervously in his hands. I like the cover, he said. Don't panic. It's the first helpful or intelligible thing anybody's said to me all day. I'll show you how it works, said Ford. He snatched it from Arthur, who was still holding it as if it was a 2-week dead lark, and pulled it out of its cover. You press this button here, you see, and the screen lights up, giving you the index. A screen, about 3 inches by 4, lit up, and characters began to flicker across the surface. You want to know about Vogon, so I entered that name, so. His fingers tapped some more keys, and there we are. The words Vogon Constructor Fleets flared in green across the screen. Ford pressed a large red button at the bottom of the screen, and words began to undulate across it. At the same time, the book began to speak the entry as well, in a still, quiet, measured voice. This is what the book said. Vogon Constructor Fleets. Here is what to do if you want to get a lift from a Vogon. Forget it. They are one of the most unpleasant races in the galaxy, not actually evil, but bad-tempered, bureaucratic, officious, and callous. They wouldn't even lift a finger to save their own grandmothers from the ravenous bug-blatter beast of Traal, without orders signed in triplicate, sent in, sent back, queried, lost, found, subjected to public inquiry, lost again, and finally buried in soft peat for 3 months and recycled as firelighters. The best way to get a drink out of a Vogon is to stick a finger down his throat. And the best way to irritate him is to feed his grandmother to the ravenous bug-blatter beast of Traal. On no account allow a Vogon to read poetry at you. Arthur blinked at it. What a strange book. How did we get a lift then? That's the point. It's out of date now, said Ford, sliding the book back into its cover. I'm doing the field research for the new revised edition, and one of the things I'll have to include is a bit about how the Vogons now employ Dantrassi cooks, which gives us rather a useful little loophole. A pained expression crossed Arthur's face. But who are the Dantrassi? He said. "Oh, great guys," said Ford. "They're the best cooks and the best drinks mixers, and they don't give a wet slap about anything else. And they'll always help hitchhikers aboard, partly because they like the company, but mostly because it annoys the Vogons, which is exactly the sort of thing you need to know if you're an impoverished hitchhiker trying to see the marvels of the universe for less than 30 Altarian dollars a day. And that's my job. Fun, isn't it?" Arthur looked lost. "It's amazing," he said, and frowned at one of the other mattresses. "Unfortunately, I got stuck on the Earth rather longer than I intended," said Ford. "I came for a week and got stuck for 15 years. "But how did you get there in the first place, then?" "Oh, easy. I got a lift with a teaser." "A teaser?" "Yeah." What is a teaser?" "Teasers are usually rich kids with nothing to do. They cruise around looking for planets which haven't made interstellar contact yet and buzz them." "Buzz them?" Arthur began to feel that Ford was enjoying making life difficult for him. "Yeah," said Ford, "they buzz them. They find some isolated spot with very few people around, then they land right by some poor unsuspecting soul whom no one's ever going to believe, and then strut up and down in front of him wearing silly antennae on their head and making beep-beep noises. Rather childish, really." Ford leant back on the mattress with his hands behind his head and looked infuriatingly pleased with himself. "Ford," insisted Arthur, "I don't know if this sounds like a silly question, but what am I doing here?" "Well, you know that," said Ford. "I rescued you from the Earth." "And, what's happened to the Earth?" "Ah, it's been demolished." "Has it?" said Arthur levelly. "Yes, it just boiled away into space." "Look," said Arthur, "I'm a bit upset about that." Ford frowned at himself and seemed to roll the thought around in his mind. "Yes, I can understand that," he said at last. "Understand that?" shouted Arthur. "Understand that?" Ford sprang up. "Keep looking at the book," he hissed urgently. "What?" "Don't panic." "I'm not panicking." "Yes, you are." "All right, so I am panicking. What else is there to do?" "You just come along with me and have a good time. The galaxy's a fun place. You need to have this fish in your ear." "I beg your pardon?" said Arthur, rather politely, he thought. Ford was holding up a small glass jar, which quite clearly had a small yellow fish wriggling around in it. Arthur blinked at him. He wished there was something simple and recognizable he could grasp hold of. He would have felt safe if alongside the Dentrassi underwear, the piles of squanchulous mattresses, and the man from Beetlejuice holding up a small yellow fish and offering to put it in his ear, if he'd been able to see just a small packet of cornflakes. But he couldn't, and he didn't feel safe. Suddenly a violent noise leapt at them from no source that he could identify. He gasped in terror at what sounded like a man trying to gargle whilst fighting off a pack of wolves. "Shh!" said Ford. "Listen, it might be important." "Important?" "It's the Vogon captain making an announcement on the tannoy." "You mean that's how Vogons talk?" "Listen!" "But I can't speak Vogon." "You don't need to. Just put this fish in your ear." Ford, with a lightning movement, clapped his hand to Arthur's ear, and he had the sudden sickening sensation of the fish slithering deep into his oral tract. Gasping with horror, he scrabbled at his ear for a second or so, but then slowly turned goggle-eyed with wonder. He was experiencing the oral equivalent of looking at a picture of two black silhouetted faces and suddenly seeing it as a picture of a white candlestick. Or of looking at a lot of coloured dots on a piece of paper, which suddenly resolve themselves into the figure 6, and mean that your optician is going to charge you a lot of money for a new pair of glasses. He was still listening to the howling gargles, he knew that, only now it had somehow taken on the semblance of perfectly straightforward English. This is what he heard. Chapter 6. Have a good time. Message repeats. This is your captain speaking, so stop whatever you're doing and pay attention. First of all, I see from our instruments that we have a couple of hitchhikers aboard. Hello, wherever you are. Just want to make it totally clear that you are not at all welcome. I worked hard to get where I am today, and I didn't become captain of a Vogon constructor ship simply so I could turn it into a taxi service for a load of degenerate freeloaders. I've sent out a search party, and as soon as they find you, I will put you off the ship. If you're very lucky, I might read you some of my poetry first. Secondly, we are about to jump into hyperspace for the journey to Barnard's Star. On arrival, we will stay in dock for a 72-hour refit, and no one's to leave the ship during that time. I repeat, all planet leave is cancelled. I've just had an unhappy love affair, so I don't see why anybody else should have a good time. Message ends. The noise stopped. Arthur discovered to his embarrassment that he was lying curled up in a small ball on the floor, with his arms wrapped around his head. He smiled weakly. "Charming man," he said. "I wish I had a daughter so I could forbid her to marry one." "You wouldn't need to," said Ford. "They've got as much sex appeal as a road accident." "No, don't move," he added as Arthur began to uncurl himself. "You'd better be prepared for the jump into hyperspace. It's unpleasantly like being drunk." "Well, what's so unpleasant about being drunk?" said Arthur. "You ask a glass of water." Arthur thought about this. "Ford," he said. "Yep." "What's this fish doing in my ear?" "It's translating for you. It's a Babel fish. Look it up in the book if you like." He tossed over the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and then curled himself up into a fetal ball to prepare himself for the jump. At that moment, the bottom fell out of Arthur's mind. His eyes turned inside out. His feet began to leak out of the top of his head. The room folded flat around him, spun around, shifted out of existence, and left him sliding into his own navel. They were passing through hyperspace. "The Babel fish," said the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy quietly, "is small, yellow, and leech-like, and probably the oddest thing in the universe. It feeds on brainwave energy received not from its own carrier, but from those around it. It absorbs all unconscious mental frequencies from this brainwave energy to nourish itself with. It then excretes into the mind of its carrier a telepathic matrix formed by combining the conscious thought frequencies with nerve signals picked up from the speech centers of the brain which has supplied them. The practical upshot of all this is that if you stick a Babel fish in your ear, you can instantly understand anything said to you in any form of language. The speech patterns you actually hear decode the brainwave matrix which has been fed into your mind by your Babel fish. Now, it is such a bizarrely improbable coincidence that anything so mind-bogglingly useful could have evolved purely by chance that some thinkers have chosen to see it as a final and clinching proof of the non-existence of God. The argument goes something like this. "I refuse to prove that I exist," says God, "for proof denies faith, and without faith I am nothing." "But," says man, "the Babel fish is a dead giveaway, isn't it? It could not have evolved by chance. It proves you exist, and so therefore, by your own arguments, you don't. QED. "Oh dear," says God, "I hadn't thought of that," and promptly vanishes in a puff of logic. "Oh, that was easy," says man, and for an encore goes on to prove that black is white, and gets himself killed on the next zebra crossing. Most leading theologians claim that this argument is a load of dingo's kidneys, but that didn't stop Ulon Kalufit making a small fortune when he used it as a central theme for his best-selling book. Well, that about wraps it up for God. Meanwhile, the poor Babel fish, by effectively removing all barriers to communication between different races and cultures, has caused more and bloodier wars than anything else in the history of creation. Arthur let out a low groan. He was horrified to discover that the kick through hyperspace hadn't killed him. He was now 6 light years from the place that the Earth would have been if it still existed. The Earth. Visions of it swam sickeningly through his nauseated mind. There was no way his imagination could feel the impact of the whole Earth having gone. It was too big. He prodded his feelings by thinking that his parents and his sister had gone. No reaction. He thought of all the people he had been close to. No reaction. Then he thought of a complete stranger he'd been standing behind in the queue at the supermarket 2 days before, and felt a sudden stab. The supermarket was gone. Everyone in it was gone. Nelson's column had gone. Nelson's column had gone, and there would be no outcry, because there was no one left to make an outcry. From now on, Nelson's column only existed in his mind. England only existed in his mind, His mind stuck here in this dank, smelly, steel-lined spaceship. A wave of claustrophobia closed in on him. England no longer existed. He'd got that. Somehow he'd got it. He tried again. America, he thought, has gone. He couldn't grasp it. He decided to start smaller again. New York has gone. No reaction. He never seriously believed it existed anyway. The dollar, he thought, has sunk forever. Slight tremor there. Every Bogart movie has been wiped, he said to himself, and that gave him a nasty knock. McDonald's, he thought, there is no longer any such thing as a McDonald's hamburger. He passed out. When he came round a second later, he found that he was sobbing for his mother. He jerked himself violently to his feet. Ford! Ford looked up from where he was sitting in a corner, humming to himself. He always found the actual travelling through space part of space travel rather trying. Yeah, he said. If you're a researcher on this book thing, and you were on Earth, you must have been gathering material on it. Well, I was able to extend the original entry a bit, yes. Let me see what it says in this edition, then. I've got to see it. Yeah, okay. Ford passed it over again. Arthur grabbed hold of it and tried to stop his hands shaking. He pressed the entry for the relevant page. The screen flashed and swirled and resolved into a page of print. Arthur stared at it. It doesn't have an entry, he burst out. Ford looked over his shoulder. Yes, it does, he said. Look, down there. See at the bottom of the screen, just under Eccentrica Golumbits, the triple-breasted whore of Eroticon 6. Arthur followed Ford's finger and saw where it was pointing. For a moment it still didn't register. Then his mind nearly blew up. What? Harmless? Is that all it's got to say? Harmless? One word? Ford shrugged. Well, there are 100 billion stars in the galaxy and only a limited amount of space in the book's microprocessors, he said. And no one knew much about the Earth, of course. Well, for God's sake, I hope you managed to rectify that a bit. Oh, yes, well, I managed to transmit a new entry off to the editor. He had to trim it a bit, but it's still an improvement. And what does it say now? Asked Arthur. Mostly harmless, admitted Ford with a slightly embarrassed cough. Mostly harmless? Shouted Arthur. What was that noise? Hissed Ford. It was me shouting! Shouted Arthur. No, shut up, said Ford. I think we're in trouble. You think we're in trouble? Outside the door were the clear sounds of marching footsteps. The Dentrassi? Whispered Arthur. No, those are steel-tipped boots, said Ford. There was a sharp, ringing rap on the door. Then who is it? Said Arthur. Well, said Ford, if we're lucky, it's just the Vogons come to throw us into space. And if we're unlucky? If we're unlucky, said Ford grimly, the captain might be serious in his threat that he's going to read us some of his poetry first. Chapter 7. Vogon poetry is, of course, the third worst in the universe. The second worst is that of the Asgoths of Krea. During a recitation by their poet-master Grunthos the Flatulent of his poem Ode to a Small Lump of Green Putty I Found in My Armpit one midsummer morning, 4 of his audience died of internal hemorrhaging, and the president of the Mid-Galactic Arts Nobbling Council survived by gnawing one of his own legs off. Grunthos is reported to have been disappointed by the poem's reception and was about to embark on a reading of his 12-book epic entitled My Favourite Bath Time Gurgles, when his own major intestine, in a desperate attempt to save life and civilization, leapt straight up through his neck and throttled his brain. The very worst poetry of all perished along with its creator, Paula Nancy Millstone Jennings of Greenbridge, Essex, England, in the destruction of the planet Earth. Prostetnik Vogon Jeltz smiled very slowly. This was not done so much for effect as because he was trying to remember the sequence of muscle movements. He had had a terribly therapeutic yell at his prisoners and was now feeling quite relaxed and ready for a little callousness. The prisoners sat in poetry appreciation chairs, strapped in. Vogon suffered no illusions as to the regard their works were generally held in. Their early attempts at composition had been part of a bludgeoning insistence that they be accepted as a properly evolved and cultured race, but now the only thing that kept them going was sheer bloody-mindedness. The sweat stood out cold on Ford Prefect's brow and slid round the electrodes strapped to his temples. These were attached to a battery of electronic equipment, imagery intensifiers, rhythmic modulators, alliterative residulators, and simile dumpers, all designed to heighten the experience of the poem and make sure that not a single nuance of the poet's thought was lost. Arthur Dent sat and quivered. He had no idea what he was in for, but he knew that he hadn't liked anything that had happened so far and didn't think things were likely to change. The Vogon began to read, a fetid little passage of his own devising. "Oh, freddled grunt bugly," he began. Spasms racked Ford's body. This was worse than even he had been prepared for. "Thy micturations are to me as splurdled gabble blotchets on a lurgid bee." "Ah!" went Ford Prefect, wrenching his head back as lumps of pain thumped through it. He could dimly see beside him Arthur lolling and rolling in his seat. He clenched his teeth. "Group, I implore thee," continued the merciless Vogon, "my foonting turlingdromes." His voice was rising to a horrible pitch of impassioned stridency. "And hooptiously drangle me with crinkly bindle wordles, or I will rend thee in the gobberwarts with my blurgle crunch, and see if I don't." cried Ford Prefect, and through one final spasm as the electronic enhancement of the last line caught him full blast across the temples, he went limp. Arthur lolled. "Now, earthlings," whirred the Vogon. He didn't know that Ford Prefect was in fact from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse, and wouldn't have cared if he had. "I present you with a simple choice. Either die in the vacuum of space, or," he paused for melodramatic effect, "tell me how good you thought my poem was." He threw himself backwards into a huge, leathery, bat-shaped seat and watched them. He did the smile again. Ford was rasping for breath. He rolled his dusty tongue round his parched mouth and moaned. Arthur said brightly, "Actually, I quite liked it." Ford turned and gaped. Here was an approach that had quite simply not occurred to him. The Vogon raised a surprised eyebrow that effectively obscured his nose, and was therefore no bad thing. "Oh, good," he whirred in considerable astonishment. "Oh, yes," said Arthur. I thought that some of the metaphysical imagery was really particularly effective." Ford continued to stare at him, slowly organising his thoughts around this totally new concept. Were they really going to be able to bareface their way out of this? "Yes, do continue," invited the Vogon. Interesting rhythmic devices too," continued Arthur, "which seem to counterpoint the he floundered. Ford leapt to his rescue, hazarding, "counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor of the he floundered too, but Arthur was ready again. "Humanity of the Vogonity," Ford hissed at him. "Oh yes, Vogonity, of the poet's compassionate soul," Arthur felt he was on the home stretch now, "which contrives, through the medium of the verse structure, to sublimate this, transcend that, and come to terms with the fundamental dichotomies of the other." He was reaching a triumphant crescendo. "And one is left with a profound and vivid insight into, suddenly gave out on him. Ford leapt in with the coup de grace. "Into whatever it was the poem was about!" he yelled. Out of the corner of his mouth, "Well done, Arthur, that was very good." The Vogon perused them. For a moment his embittered racial soul had been touched, but he thought, no, too little, too late. His voice took on the quality of a cat snagging brushed nylon. "So what you're saying is that I write poetry because underneath my mean, callous, heartless exterior, I really just want to be loved," he said. "Is that right?" Ford laughed a nervous laugh. "Well, I mean, yes," he said. "Don't we all, deep down, you know?" The Vogon stood up. "No, well, you're completely wrong," he said. "I just write poetry to throw my mean, callous, heartless exterior into sharp relief. I'm going to throw you off the ship anyway. Guard, take the prisoners to number 3 airlock and throw them out." "What?" shouted Ford. A huge young Vogon guard stepped forward and yanked them out of their straps with his huge blubbery arms. "You can't throw us into space!" yelled Ford. "We're trying to write a book!" "Resistance is useless!" shouted the Vogon guard back at him. It was the first phrase he'd learnt when he joined the Vogon Guard Corps. The captain watched with detached amusement and then turned away. Arthur stared round him wildly. "I don't want to die now," he yelled. "I've still got a headache. I don't want to go to heaven with a headache. I'd be all cross and wouldn't enjoy it." The guard grasped them both firmly round the neck and, bowing deferentially towards his captain's back, hoiked them both protesting out of the bridge. The steel door closed and the captain was on his own again. He hummed quietly and mused to himself, lightly fingering his notebook of verses. He said. "Counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor." He considered this for a moment and then closed the book with a grim smile. "Death's too good for them," he said. The long, steel-lined corridor echoed to the feeble struggles of the two humanoids clamped firmly under the rubbery Vogon armpits. "This is great!" spluttered Arthur. "This is really terrific! Let go of me, you brute!" The Vogon guard dragged them on. "Don't you worry," said Ford. "I'll think of something." He didn't sound too hopeful. "Resistance is useless!" bellowed the guard. "Just don't say things like that," stammered Ford. "How can anyone maintain a positive mental attitude if you're saying things like that?" "My God," complained Arthur, "you're talking about a positive mental attitude and you haven't even had your planet demolished today. I woke up this morning and thought I'd have a nice relaxed day, do a bit of reading, brush the dog. It's now just after 4 in the afternoon and I'm already being thrown out of an alien spaceship 6 light years from the smoking remains of the Earth." He spluttered and gurgled as the Vogon tightened his grip. "All right," said Ford, "just stop panicking." "Who said anything about panicking?" snapped Arthur. "This is still just culture shock. You wait till I've settled down to the situation and found my bearings. Then I'll start panicking." "Arthur, you're getting hysterical. Shut up." Ford tried desperately to think, but was interrupted by the guard shouting again. "Resistance is useless!" "And you can shut up as well," snapped Ford. "Resistance is useless!" "Oh, give it a rest," said Ford. He twisted his head till he was looking straight up into his captor's face. A thought struck him. "Do you really enjoy this sort of thing?" he asked suddenly. The Vogon stopped dead, and a look of immense stupidity seeped slowly over his face. "Enjoy?" he boomed. "What do you mean?" "What I mean," said Ford, "is does it give you a full, satisfying life? I mean, stomping around, shouting, pushing people out of spaceships?" The Vogon stared up at the low steel ceiling, and his eyebrows almost rolled over each other. His mouth slacked. Finally he said, "Well, the hours are good." "They'd have to be," agreed Ford. Arthur twisted his head round to look at Ford. "Ford, what are you doing?" he asked in an amazed whisper. "Oh, just trying to take an interest in the world around me, okay?" he said. "So, the hours are pretty good then," he resumed. The Vogon stared down at him as sluggish thoughts moiled around in the murky depths. "Yeah," he said, "but now you come to mention it, most of the actual minutes are pretty lousy. Except," he thought again, which required looking at the ceiling, "except some of the shouting I quite like." He filled his lungs and bellowed, "Resistance is—" Yeah, sure, interrupted Ford hurriedly. "You're good at that, I can tell. But if it's mostly lousy," he said slowly, giving the words time to reach their mark, "then why do you do it? What is it? The girls, the leather, the machismo, or do you just find that coming to terms with the mindless tedium of it all presents an interesting challenge?" Arthur looked backwards and forwards between them in bafflement. Said the guard. I don't know. I think I just sort of do it, really. My aunt said that Spaceship Girl was a good career for a young Vogon. You know, the uniform, the low-slung stun ray holster, the mindless tedium. "There you are, Arthur," said Ford, with the air of someone reaching the conclusion of his argument. "You think you've got problems?" Arthur rather thought he had. Apart from the unpleasant business with his home planet, the Vogon guard had half-throttled him already, and he didn't like the sound of being thrown into space very much. "Try and understand his problem," insisted Ford. "Here he is, poor lad. His entire life's work is stamping around, throwing people off spaceships, and shouting," added the guard. And shouting, sure, said Ford, patting the blubbery arm clamped around his neck in friendly condescension. And he doesn't even know why he's doing it. Arthur agreed this was very sad. He did this with a small, feeble gesture because he was too asphyxiated to speak. Deep rumblings of bemusement came from the guard. Well, now you put it like that, I suppose. Good lad, encouraged Ford. But, all right, went on the rumblings. So what's the alternative? Well, said Ford, brightly but slowly, stop doing it, of course. Tell them, he went on, you're not going to do it anymore. He felt he ought to add something to that, but for the moment the guard seemed to have his mind occupied pondering that much. Said the guard. Well, that doesn't sound that great to me. Ford suddenly felt the moment slipping away. No, wait a minute, he said. That's just a start, you see. There's more to it than that, you see. But at that moment, the guard renewed his grip and continued his original purpose of lugging his prisoners to the airlock. He was obviously quite touched. No, I think if it's all the same to you, he said, I'd better get you both shoved into this airlock and then go and get on with some other bits of shouting I've got to do. It wasn't all the same to Ford Prefect at all. Come on now, but look, he said, less slowly, less brightly. Said Arthur without any clear inflection. But hang on, pursued Ford. There's music and art and things to tell you about. Oh! Resistance is useless, bellowed the guard, and then added, you see, if I can keep it up, I can eventually get promoted to senior shouting officer, and there aren't usually many vacancies for non-shouting and non-pushing people about officers, so I think I'd better stick to what I know. They had now reached the airlock. A large circular steel hatchway of massive strength and weight let into the inner skin of the craft. The guard operated the control and the hatchway swung smoothly open. But thanks for taking an interest, said the Vogon guard. Bye now! He flung Ford and Arthur through the hatchway into the small chamber within. Arthur lay panting for breath. Ford scrambled around and flung his shoulder uselessly against the reclosing hatchway. But listen, he shouted to the guard. There's a whole world you don't know anything about yet. Here, how about this? Desperately, he grabbed for the only bit of culture he knew offhand. He hummed the first bar of Beethoven's Fifth. Da-da-da-dum! Doesn't that stir anything in you? No, said the guard. Not really, but I'll mention it to my aunt. If he said anything further after that, it was lost. The hatchway sealed itself tight, and all sound was lost bar the faint, distant hum of the ship's engines. They were in a brightly polished cylindrical chamber about 6 feet in diameter and 10 feet long. Ford looked around it, panting. A potentially bright lad, I thought, he said, and slumped against the curved wall. Arthur was still lying in the curve of the floor where he had fallen. He didn't look up. He just lay, panting. We're trapped now, aren't we? Yes, said Ford. We're trapped. Well, didn't you think of anything? I thought you said you were going to think of something. Perhaps you thought of something I didn't notice. Oh, yes. I thought of something, panted Ford. Arthur looked up expectantly. But unfortunately, continued Ford, it rather involved being on the other side of this airtight hatchway. He kicked the hatch they'd just been thrown through. But it was a good idea, was it? Oh, yes, it was very neat. What was it? Well, I hadn't worked out all the details yet. Not much point now, is there? So, what happens next? Asked Arthur. Oh, well, the hatchway in front of us will open automatically in a few moments, and we will shoot out into deep space, I expect, and, asphyxiate. I mean, if you breathe hard for a few moments beforehand, and then expel all the air from your lungs, you can last out there for, a good 30 seconds, said Ford. He stuck his hands behind his back, raised his eyebrows, and started to hum an old Beetlejuicean battle hymn. To Arthur's eyes, he suddenly looked very alien. So, this is it, said Arthur. We're going to die. Yes, said Ford. Except, no, wait a minute. He suddenly lunged across the chamber at something behind Arthur's line of vision. What's this switch? He cried. What? Where? Cried Arthur, twisting around. No, I was only fooling, said Ford. We are going to die after all. His slumped against the wall again and carried on the tune from where he had left off. "You know," said Arthur, "it's at times like this, when I'm trapped in a Vogon airlock with a man from Beetlejuice and about to die of asphyxiation in deep space, that I really wish I'd listened to what my mother told me when I was young." "Why, what did she tell you?" "I don't know, I didn't listen." "Oh," Ford carried on humming. "This is terrific," Arthur thought to himself. "Nelson's column has gone, MacDonald's have gone, and all that's left is me and the words mostly harmless. Any second now, all that will be left is mostly harmless. And yesterday the planet seemed to be doing so well." A motor whirred. A slight hiss built into a deafening roar of rushing air as the outer hatchway opened onto an empty blackness studded with tiny, impossibly bright points of light. Ford and Arthur popped into outer space like corks from a toy gun. Chapter 8. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a wholly remarkable book. It has been compiled and recompiled many times over many years and under many different editorships. It contains contributions from countless numbers of travellers and researchers. The introduction begins like this. "Space," it says, "is big, really big. You just won't believe how vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big it is. I mean, you may think it's a long way down the road to the chemist, but that's just peanuts of space. Listen." And so on. After a while, the style settles down a bit, and it begins to tell you things you really need to know, like the fact that the fabulously beautiful planet Bethselamin is now so worried about the cumulative erosion caused by 10 billion visiting tourists a year that any net imbalance between the amount you eat and the amount you excrete whilst on the planet is surgically removed from your body weight when you leave. So every time you go to the lavatory there, it is vitally important to get a receipt. To be fair, though, when confronted by the sheer enormity of the distances between the stars, better minds than the one responsible for the guide's introduction have faltered. Some invite you to consider for a moment a peanut in Reading and a small walnut in Idaho, and other such dizzying concepts. The simple truth is that interstellar distances will not fit into the human imagination. Even light, which travels so fast that it takes most races thousands of years to realize that it travels at all, takes time to journey between the stars. It takes 8 minutes to journey from the star Sol to the place where the Earth used to be, and 4 years more to arrive at Sol's nearest stellar neighbor, Alpha Proxima. For light to reach the other side of the galaxy, for it to reach Damagran, for instance, takes rather longer. 500,000 years. The record for hitchhiking this distance is just under 5 years, but you don't get to see much on the way. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy says that if you hyperventilate and then empty your lungs, you can survive in the total vacuum of space for about 30 seconds. However, it does go on to say that, what with space being the mind-boggling size it is, the chances of getting picked up by another ship within those 30 seconds are 2 to the power of 276,709 to 1 against. By a totally staggering coincidence, that is also the telephone number of an Islington flat where Arthur once went to a very good party and met a very nice girl whom he totally failed to get off with. She went off with a gatecrasher. Though the planet Earth, the Islington flat and the telephone have all now been demolished, it is comforting to reflect that they are all in some small way commemorated by the fact that 29 seconds later, Ford and Arthur were rescued. Chapter 9. A computer chattered to itself in alarm as it noticed an airlock open and close itself for no apparent reason. This was because reason was in fact out to lunch. A hole had just appeared in the galaxy. It was exactly a nothingth of a second long, a nothingth of an inch wide, and quite a lot of millions of light years from end to end. As it closed up, lots of paper hats and party balloons fell out of it and drifted off through the universe. A team of 7 3-foot-high market analysts fell out of it and died, partly of asphyxiation and partly of surprise. 239,000 lightly fried eggs fell out of it too, materializing in a large wobbly heap on the famine-struck land of Pogril in the Pansel system. The whole Pogril tribe had died out from famine, except for one last man who died of cholesterol poisoning some weeks later. The nothing of a second for which the whole existed reverberated backwards and forwards through time in a most improbable fashion. Somewhere in the deeply remote past, it seriously traumatized a small random group of atoms drifting through the empty sterility of space and made them cling together in the most extraordinarily unlikely patterns. These patterns quickly learnt to copy themselves. This was part of what was so extraordinary about the patterns, and went on to cause massive trouble on every planet they drifted onto. That was how life began in the universe. 5 wild event maelstroms swirled in vicious storms of unreason and spewed up a pavement. On the pavement lay Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent, gulping like half-spent fish. "There you are!" gasped Ford, scrabbling for a finger-hold on the pavement as it raced through the third reach of the unknown. "I told you I'd think of something!" "Oh, sure," said Arthur, "sure." "Bright idea of mine," said Ford, "to find a passing spaceship and get rescued by it." The real universe arched sickeningly away beneath them. Various pretend ones flitted silently by like mountain goats. Primal light exploded, splattering space-time with gobbets of junket. Time blossomed, matter shrank away. The highest prime number coalesced quietly in a corner and hid itself away forever. "Oh, come off it," said Arthur. "The chances against it were astronomical." "Don't knock it. It worked," said Ford. What sort of ship are we in?" asked Arthur as the pit of eternity yawned beneath them. "I don't know," said Ford. I haven't opened my eyes yet." "No, nor have I," said Arthur. The universe jumped, froze, quivered, and splayed out in several unexpected directions. Arthur and Ford opened their eyes and looked about in considerable surprise. "Good God," said Arthur. "It looks just like the seafront at Southend." "Hell, I'm relieved to hear you say that," said Ford. "Why?" "Because I thought I must be going mad." "Well, perhaps you are. Perhaps you only thought I said it." Ford thought about this. "Well, did you say it or didn't you?" he asked. "I think so," said Arthur. "Well, perhaps we're both going mad." "Yes," said Arthur. "We'd be mad, all things considered, to think this was Southend." "Well, do you think it's Southend?" "Oh, yes." "So do I." "Therefore we must be mad." "Nice day for it." "Yes," said a passing maniac. "Who is that?" asked Arthur. "Who? The man with the 5 heads and the elderberry bush full of kippers?" "Yes." "I don't know, just someone." "Ah." They both sat on the pavement and watched with a certain unease as huge children bounced heavily along the sand and wild horses thundered through the sky, taking fresh supplies of reinforced railings to the uncertain areas. "You know," said Arthur with a slight cough, "if this is Southend, there's something very odd about it." "You mean the way the sea stays steady as a rock and the buildings keep washing up and down?" said Ford. "Yes, I thought that was odd too. In fact," he continued, as with a huge bang Southend split itself into 6 equal segments, which danced and spun giddily around each other in lewd and licentious formations, "there is something altogether very strange going on." Wild, yowling noises of pipes and strings seared through the wind. Hot doughnuts popped out of the road for 10 pence each. Horrid fish stormed out of the sky, and Ford and Arthur decided to make a run for it. They plunged through heavy walls of sound, mountains of archaic thought, valleys of mood music, bad shoe sessions and footling bats, and suddenly heard a girl's voice. It sounded quite a sensible voice, but it just said, 2 to the power of 100,000 to 1 against, and falling. And that was all. Ford skidded down a beam of light and spun round, trying to find a source for the voice, but could see nothing he could seriously believe in. "What was that voice?" shouted Arthur. "I don't know," yelled Ford. "I don't know. It sounded like a measurement of probability." "Probability? What do you mean?" improbability, like 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 5 to 4 against. It said 2 to the power of 100,000 to 1 against. That's pretty improbable, A 1,000,000-gallon vat of custard upended itself over them without warning. But what does it mean? Cried Arthur. What, the custard? No, the measurement of improbability. I don't know at all. I think we're on some kind of spaceship. I can only assume, said Arthur, that this is not the first-class compartment. Bulges appeared in the fabric of space-time, great ugly bulges. Said Arthur, as he felt his body softening and bending in unusual directions. South End seems to be melting away. The stars are swirling, a dust bowl. My legs are drifting off into the sunset. My left arm's come off too. A frightening thought struck him. Hell, he said, how am I going to operate my digital watch now? He wound his eyes desperately round in Ford's direction. Ford, he said, you're turning into a penguin. Stop it. Again came the voice. 2 to the power of 75,000 to 1 against and falling. Ford waddled round his pond in a furious circle. Hey, who are you? He quacked. Where are you? What's going on, and is there any way of stopping it? Please relax, said the voice pleasantly, like a stewardess in an airliner with only 1 wing and 2 engines, one of which is on fire. You are perfectly safe. But that's not the point, raged Ford. The point is that I am now a perfectly safe penguin, and my colleague here is rapidly running out of limbs. It's all right, I've got them back now, said Arthur. 2 to the power of 50,000 to 1 against and falling, said the voice. Admittedly, said Arthur, they're longer than I usually like them, but isn't there anything, squawked Ford in avian fury, you feel you ought to be telling us? The voice cleared its throat. A giant putty 4 lolloped off into the distance. Welcome, the voice said, to the starship Heart of Gold. The voice continued. Please do not be alarmed, it said, by anything you see or hear around you. You are bound to feel some initial ill effects as you have been rescued from certain death at an improbability level of 2 to the power of 276,000 to 1 against, possibly much higher. We are now cruising at a level of 2 to the power of 25,000 to 1 against and falling, and we will be restoring normality just as soon as we are sure what is normal anyway. Thank you. 2 to the power of 20,000 to 1 against and falling. The voice cut out. Ford and Arthur were in a small, luminous, pink cubicle. Ford was wildly excited. Arthur, he said, this is fantastic. We've been picked up by a ship powered by the infinite improbability drive. This is incredible. I heard rumours about it before. They were all officially denied, but they must have done it. They've built the improbability drive. Arthur, Arthur, what's happening? Arthur had jammed himself against the door to the cubicle, trying to hold it closed, but it was ill-fitting. Tiny, furry little hands were squeezing themselves through the cracks. Their fingers were ink-stained. Tiny voices chattered insanely. Arthur looked up. Ford, he said, there's an infinite number of monkeys outside who want to talk to us about the script for Hamlet they've worked out. Chapter 10. The infinite improbability drive is a wonderful new method of crossing vast interstellar distances in a mere nothingth of a second without all that tedious mucking about in hyperspace. It was discovered by a lucky chance, and then developed into a governable form of propulsion by the Galactic Government's research team on Damagran. This, briefly, is the story of its discovery. The principle of generating small amounts of finite improbability by simply hooking the logic circuits of a Bambleweenie 57 sub-meson brain to an atomic vector plotter suspended in a strong Brownian motion producer, say a nice hot cup of tea, was of course well understood, and such generators were often used to break the ice at parties by making all the molecules in the hostess's undergarments leap simultaneously 1 foot to the left, in accordance with the theory of indeterminacy. Many respectable physicists said they weren't going to stand for this sort of thing, partly because it was a debasement of science, but mostly because they didn't get invited to those sort of parties. Another thing they couldn't stand was the perpetual failure they encountered in trying to construct a machine which could generate the infinite improbability field needed to flip a spaceship across the mind-paralyzing distances between the furthest stars. And in the end they grumpily announced that such a machine was virtually impossible. Then, one day, a student who'd been left to sweep up the lab after a particularly unsuccessful party found himself reasoning this way. If, he thought to himself, such a machine is a virtual impossibility, then it must logically be a finite improbability. So, all I have to do in order to make one is to work out exactly how improbable it is, feed that figure into the finite improbability generator, give it a fresh cup of really hot tea, and turn it on. He did this and was rather startled to discover that he had managed to create the long sought-after golden infinite improbability generator out of thin air. It startled him even more when, just after he was awarded the Galactic Institute's prize for extreme cleverness, he got lynched by a rampaging mob of respectable physicists who had finally realized that the one thing they really couldn't stand was a smartass. Chapter 11. The improbability-proof control cabin of the Heart of Gold looked like a perfectly conventional spaceship, except that it was perfectly clean because it was so new. Some of the control seats hadn't had the plastic wrapping taken off yet. The cabin was mostly white, oblong, and about the size of a smallish restaurant. In fact, it wasn't perfectly oblong. The two long walls were raked round in a slight parallel curve, and all the angles and corners of the cabin were contoured in excitingly chunky shapes. The truth of the matter is that it would have been a great deal simpler and more practical to build the cabin as an ordinary three-dimensional oblong room, but then the designers would have got miserable. As it was, the cabin looked excitingly purposeful, with large video screens ranged over the control and guidance system panels on the concave wall, and long banks of computers set into the convex wall. In one corner, a robot sat humped, its gleaming brushed steel head hanging loosely between its gleaming brushed steel knees. It too was fairly new, but though it was beautifully constructed and polished, it somehow looked as if the various parts of its more or less humanoid body didn't quite fit properly. In fact, they fitted perfectly well, but something in its bearing suggested that they might have fitted better. Zaphod Beeblebrox paced nervously up and down the cabin, brushing his hands over pieces of gleaming equipment and giggling with excitement. Trillian sat hunched over a clump of instruments, reading off figures. Her voice was carried around the tannoy system of the whole ship. 5 to 1 against and falling, she said. 4 to 1 against and falling. 3 to 1. 2. 1. Probability factor of 1 to 1. We have normality. I repeat, we have normality. She turned her microphone off, then turned it back on with a slight smile and continued. Anything you still can't cope with is therefore your own problem. Please relax, you will be sent for soon. Zaphod burst out in annoyance. Who are they, Trillian? Trillian spun her seat round to face him and shrugged. Just a couple of guys who seem to have picked up in open space, she said. Sector ZZ9, plural Z Alpha. Yeah, well, that's a very sweet thought, Trillian, complained Zaphod, but do you really think it's wise under the circumstances? I mean, here we are on the run and everything. We must have the police of half the galaxy after us by now, and we stopped to pick up hitchhikers. Okay, so 10 out of 10 for style, but minus several million for good thinking, okay? He tapped irritably at the control panel. Trillian quietly moved his hands before he tapped anything important. Whatever Zaphod's qualities of mind might include, dash, bravado, conceit, he was mechanically inept and could easily blow the ship up with an extravagant gesture. Trillian had come to suspect that the main reason why he had had such a wild and successful life was that he never really understood the significance of anything he did. Zaphod, she said patiently, they were floating unprotected in open space. You wouldn't want them to have died, would you? Well, no, not as such, but... Not as such? Not die as such? But... Trillian cocked her head on one side. Well, maybe someone else might have picked them up later. A second later and they would have been dead. Yeah, so if you'd taken the trouble to think about the problem a bit longer, it would have gone away, huh? You would have been happy to let them die? Well, I'm not happy as such, but... Anyway, said Trillian, turning back to the controls, I didn't pick them up. What do you mean? Who picked them up, then? The ship did. Huh? The ship did, all by itself. Huh? Whilst we were in improbability drive. But that's incredible. No, Zaphod, just very, very improbable. Yeah. Look, Zaphod, she said, patting his arm, Don't worry about the aliens. They're just a couple of guys, I expect. I'll send the robot down to get them and bring them up here. Hey, Marvin!" In the corner, the robot's head swung up sharply, but then wobbled about imperceptibly. It pulled itself up to its feet as if it was about 5 pounds heavier than it actually was, and made what an outside observer would have thought was a heroic effort to cross the room. It stopped in front of Trillian and seemed to stare through her left shoulder. "I think you ought to know I'm feeling very depressed," it said. Its voice was low and hopeless. "Oh, God," muttered Zaphod and slumped into a seat. "Well," said Trillian in a bright, compassionate tone, "here's something to occupy you and keep your mind off things." "It won't work," droned Marvin. "I have an exceptionally large mind." "Marvin," warned Trillian. "All right," said Marvin. "What do you want me to do?" "Go down to number 2 entry bay and bring the 2 aliens up here under surveillance." With a microsecond pause and a finely calculated micromodulation of pitch and timbre, nothing he could actually take offence at, Marvin managed to convey his utter contempt and horror of all things human. "Just that?" he said. "Yes," said Trillian firmly. "I won't enjoy it," said Marvin. Zaphod leapt out of his seat. "She's not asking you to enjoy it," he shouted. "Just do it, will you?" "All right," said Marvin, like the tolling of a great cracked bell. "I'll do it." "Good," snapped Zaphod. "Great, thank you." Marvin turned and lifted his flat-topped, triangular red eyes up towards him. "I'm not getting you down at all, am I?" he said pathetically. "No, Marvin," lilted Trillian. "That's just fine, really." "I wouldn't like to think I was getting you down." "No, don't worry about that," the lilt continued. "You just act as comes naturally and everything will be just fine." "You're sure you don't mind?" probed Marvin. No, Marvin," lilted Trillian. "That's just fine, really. Just part of life." Marvin flashed an electronic look. "Life," said Marvin. "Don't talk to me about life." He turned hopelessly on his heel and lugged himself out of the cabin. With a satisfied hum and click, the door closed behind him. "I don't think I can stand that robot much longer, Zaphod," growled Trillian. The Encyclopedia Galactica defines a robot as a mechanical apparatus designed to do the work of a man. The marketing division of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation defines a robot as your plastic pal who's fun to be with. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy defines the marketing division of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation as a bunch of mindless jerks who'll be the first against the wall when the revolution comes, with a footnote to the effect that the editors would welcome applications from anyone interested in taking over the post of robotics correspondent. Curiously enough, an edition of the Encyclopedia Galactica that had the good fortune to fall through a time warp from 1,000 years in the future defined the marketing division of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation as a bunch of mindless jerks who were the first against the wall when the revolution came. The pink cubicle had winked out of existence. The monkeys had sunk away to a better dimension. Ford and Arthur found themselves in the embarkation area of the ship. It was rather smart. "I think this ship's brand new," said Ford. "How can you tell?" asked Arthur. "Have you got some exotic device for measuring the age of metal?" "No, I just found the sales brochure lying on the floor. It's a lot of the universe can be yours stuff." "Ah, look, I was right." Ford jabbed at one of the pages and showed it to Arthur. It says, "Sensational new breakthrough in improbability physics. As soon as the ship's drive reaches infinite improbability, it passes through every point in the universe. Be the envy of other major governments." Wow, this is big league stuff. Ford hunted excitedly through the technical specs of the ship, occasionally gasping with astonishment at what he read. Clearly, galactic astrotechnology had moved ahead during the years of his exile. Arthur listened for a short while, but being unable to understand the vast majority of what Ford was saying, he began to let his mind wander. Trailing his fingers along the edge of an incomprehensible computer bank, he reached out and pressed an invitingly large red button on a nearby panel. The panel lit up with the words, "Please do not press this button again." He shook himself. "Listen," said Ford, who was still engrossed in the sales brochure. "They make a big thing of the ship's cybernetics. a new generation of Sirius Cybernetics Corporation robots and computers with the new GPP feature. GPP feature, said Arthur. What's that? Oh, it says genuine people personalities. Yeah, said Arthur. Sounds ghastly. A voice behind them said, "It is." The voice was low and hopeless and accompanied by a slight clanking sound. They spun round and saw an abject steel man standing hunched in the doorway. "What?" they said. "Ghastly," continued Marvin. "It all is absolutely ghastly. Just don't even talk about it. Look at this door," he said, stepping through it. The irony circuits cut into his voice modulator as he mimicked the style of the sales brochure. "All the doors in the spaceship have a cheerful and sunny disposition. It is their pleasure to open for you and their satisfaction to close again with the knowledge of a job well done." As the door closed behind them, it became apparent that it did indeed have a satisfied, sigh-like quality to it. Yeah, it said. Marvin regarded it with cold loathing, whilst his logic circuits chattered with disgust and tinkered with the concept of directing physical violence against it. Further circuits cut in, saying, "Why bother? What's the point? Nothing is worth getting involved in." Further circuits amused themselves by analysing the molecular components of the door and of the humanoid's brain cells. For a quick encore, they measured the level of hydrogen emissions in the surrounding cubic parsec of space, and then shut down again in boredom. A spasm of despair shook the robot's body as he turned. "Come on," he droned. "I've been ordered to take you down to the bridge. Here I am, brain the size of a planet, and they ask me to take you down to the bridge. Call that job satisfaction? 'Cause I don't." He turned and walked back to the hated door. Excuse me," said Ford, following after him. "Which government owns this ship?" Marvin ignored him. "You watch this door," he muttered. "It's about to open again. I can tell by the intolerable air of smugness it suddenly generates." With an ingratiating little whine, the door slid open again, and Marvin stomped through. "Come on," he said. The others followed quickly, and the door slid back into place, with pleased little clicks and whirs. "Thank you, the marketing division of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation," said Marvin, and trudged desolately up the gleaming curved corridor that stretched out before them. "Let's build robots with genuine people personalities," they said. "So they tried it out with me. I'm a personality prototype. You can tell, can't you?" Ford and Arthur muttered embarrassed little disclaimers. "I hate that door," continued Marvin. "I'm not getting you down at all, am I?" "Which government?" started Ford again. "No government owns it," snapped the robot. "It's been stolen." "Stolen?" said Ford. "Stolen?" mimicked Marvin. "Who by?" asked Ford. "Zaphod Beeblebrox." Something extraordinary happened to Ford's face. At least 5 entirely separate and distinct expressions of shock and amazement piled up on it in a jumbled mess. His left leg, which was in mid-stride, seemed to have difficulty in finding the floor again. He stared at the robot and tried to disentangle some dartoid muscles. "Zaphod Beeblebrox," he said weakly. "Sorry, did I say something wrong?" said Marvin, dragging himself on regardless. "Pardon me for breathing, which I never do anyway, so I don't know why I bothered to say it. Oh God, I'm so depressed. Here's another of those self-satisfied doors. Life. Don't talk to me about life." "No one even mentioned it," muttered Arthur irritably. "Ford, are you all right?" Ford stared at him. "Did that robot say Zaphod Beeblebrox?" he said. Chapter 12. A loud clatter of gunk music flooded through the Heart of Gold cabin as Zaphod searched the sub-ether radio wave bands for news of himself. The machine was rather difficult to operate. For years, radios had been operated by means of pressing buttons and turning dials. Then, as the technology became more sophisticated, the controls were made touch-sensitive. You merely had to brush the panels with your fingers. Now all you had to do was wave your hands in the general direction of the components and hope. It saved a lot of muscular expenditure, of course, but meant that you had to sit infuriatingly still if you wanted to keep listening to the same program. Zaphod waved a hand and the channel switched again. More gunk music, but this time it was a background to a news announcement. The news was always heavily edited to fit the rhythms of the music. And news reports brought to you here on the sub-ether waveband, broadcasting around the galaxy, around the clock, squawked a voice. And we'll be saying a big hello to all intelligent life forms everywhere. And to everyone else out there, the secret is to bang the rocks together, guys. And of course, the big news story tonight is the sensational theft of the new Improbability Drive prototype ship by none other than Galactic President Zaphod Beeblebrox. And the question everyone's asking is, has the Big Z finally flipped? Beeblebrox, the man who invented the Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster, ex-confidence trickster, once described by eccentric Golumbits as the best bang since the big one, and recently voted the worst-dressed sentient being in the known universe for the 7th time. Has he got an answer this time? We asked his private brain care specialist, Gag Halfront. The music swirled and dived for a moment. Another voice broke in, presumably Halfront. He said, "Well, Zaphod's just this guy, you know." But got no further because an electric pencil flew across the cabin and through the radio's on-off sensitive airspace. Zaphod turned and glared at Trillian. She had thrown the pencil. "Hey," he said, "what'd you do that for?" Trillian was tapping her finger on a screen full of figures. "I've just thought of something," she said. "Oh, yeah? Worth interrupting a news bulletin about me for?" "You hear enough about yourself as it is." "I'm very insecure, we know that." "Can we drop your ego for a moment? This is important." "If there's anything more important than my ego around, I want it caught and shot now." Zaphod glared at her again, then laughed. "Listen," she said, "we'd picked up those couple of guys." "What couple of guys?" "The couple of guys we picked up." Oh yeah, said Zaphod, "those couple of guys. We picked them up in sector ZZ9 plural Z alpha." "Yeah?" said Zaphod and blinked. Trillian said quietly, "Does that mean anything to you?" Said Zaphod. ZZ9 plural Z alpha. ZZ9 plural Z alpha. "Well," said Trillian. What does the Z mean?" said Zaphod. "Which one?" "Oh, anyone." One of the major difficulties Trillian experienced in her relationship with Zaphod was learning to distinguish between him pretending to be stupid just to get people off their guard, pretending to be stupid because he couldn't be bothered to think and wanted someone else to do it for him, pretending to be outrageously stupid to hide the fact that he actually didn't understand what was going on, and really being genuinely stupid. He was renowned for being amazingly clever, and quite clearly was so, but not all the time, which obviously worried him, hence the act. He preferred people to be puzzled rather than contemptuous. This, above all, appeared to Trillian to be genuinely stupid, but she could no longer be bothered to argue about it. She sighed and punched up a star map on the Visi screen, so she could make it simple for him, whatever his reasons for wanting it to be that way. "There," she pointed, "right there." "Hey! Yeah," said Zaphod. "Well," she said. "Well what?" Parts of the inside of her head screamed at other parts of the inside of her head. She said very calmly, "It's the same sector you originally picked me up in." He looked at her and then looked back at the screen. "Hey, yeah," he said. "Now that is wild. We should have zapped straight into the middle of the Horsehead Nebula. How do we come to be there? I mean, that's nowhere." She ignored this. "Improbability drive," she said patiently. "You explained it to me yourself. We pass through every point in the universe. You know that." "Yeah, but that's one wild coincidence, isn't it?" "Yes." "Picking someone up at that point, out of the whole universe to choose from? That's just too... I want to work this out. Computer?" The Sirius Cybernetics shipboard computer, which controlled and permeated every particle of the ship, switched into communication mode. "Hi there," it said brightly, and simultaneously spewed out a tiny ribbon of ticker tape just for the record. The ticker tape said, "Hi there." "Oh, God," said Zaphod. He hadn't worked with this computer for long, but had already learned to loathe it. The computer continued, brash and cheery, as if it was selling detergent. "I want you to know that whatever your problem, I am here to help you solve it." Yeah, said Zaphod. "Look, I think I'll just use a piece of paper." "Sure thing," said the computer, spilling out its message into a waste bin at the same time. "I understand. If you ever want—" "Shut up," said Zaphod, and snatching up a pencil, sat down next to Trillian at the console. Okay, said the computer in a hurt tone of voice, and closed down its speech channel again. Zaphod and Trillian pored over the figures that the improbability flight path scanner flashed silently up in front of them. Can we work out, said Zayford, from their point of view, what the improbability of their rescue was? Yes, that's a constant, said Trillian. 2 to the power of 276,709 to 1 against. Oh, that's high. They're two lucky guys. Yes. But relative to what we were doing when the ship picked them up, Trillian punched up the figures. They showed 2 to the power of infinity minus 1 to 1 against, an irrational number that only has a conventional meaning in improbability physics. It's pretty low, continued Zayford with a slight whistle. Yes, agreed Trillian, and looked at him quizzically. That's one big whack of improbability to be accounted for. I mean, something pretty improbable has got to show up on the balance sheet if it's all going to add up into a pretty sum. Zayford scribbled a few sums, crossed them out, and threw the pencil away. Bats dues, I can't work it out. Well, Zayford knocked his two heads together in irritation and gritted his teeth. Okay, he said, computer. The voice circuit sprang to life again. Why, hello there, they said, ticker-tape, ticker-tape. All I want to do is to make your day nicer and nicer and nicer. Well, shut up and work something out for me. Sure thing, chattered the computer. You want a probability forecast based on improbability data? Yeah, said Zayford. Okay, the computer continued. Here's an interesting little notion. Did you realize that most people's lives are governed by telephone numbers? A pained look crawled across one of Zayford's faces and onto the other one. Have you flipped? He said. No, but you will when I tell you that... Trillian gasped. She scrabbled at the buttons on the improbability flight path screen. Telephone number, she said. Did that thing say telephone number? Numbers flashed up on the screen. The computer had paused politely, but now it continued. What I was about to say was that... Don't bother, please, said Trillian. Look, what is this? Said Zayford. I don't know, said Trillian, but those aliens... They're on the way up to the bridge with that wretched robot. Can we pick them up on any monitor cameras? Chapter 13. Marvin trudged on down the corridor, still moaning. And then, of course, I've got this terrible pain in all the diodes down my left-hand side. No, said Arthur grimly as he walked along beside him. Really? Oh, yes, said Marvin. I mean, I've asked for them to be replaced, but no one ever listens. I can imagine. Vague whistling and humming noises were coming from Ford. Well, he kept on saying to himself. Zayford Beeblebrox. Suddenly Marvin stopped and held up a hand. You know what's happened now, of course. No, what? Said Arthur, who didn't want to know. We've arrived at another of those doors. There was a sliding door let into the side of the corridor. Marvin eyed it suspiciously. Well, said Ford impatiently, do we go through? Do we go through? Mimicked Marvin. Yes, this is the entrance to the bridge. I was told to take you to the bridge. Probably the highest demand that will be made on my intellectual capacities today, I shouldn't wonder. Slowly, with great loathing, he stepped towards the door, like a hunter stalking his prey. Suddenly, it slid open. Thank you, it said, for making a simple door very happy. Deep in Marvin's thorax, gears ground. Funny, he intoned funereally, how just when you think life can't possibly get any worse, it suddenly does. He heaved himself through the door and left Ford and Arthur staring at each other and shrugging their shoulders. From inside, they heard Marvin's voice again. I suppose you'll want to see the aliens now, he said. Do you want me to sit in a corner and rust, or just fall apart where I'm standing? Yeah, just show them in, would you, Marvin? Came another voice. Arthur looked at Ford and was astonished to see him laughing. What's... Shh, said Ford. Come on in. He stepped through onto the bridge. Arthur followed him in nervously and was astonished to see a man lolling back in a chair with his feet on a control console, picking the teeth in his right-hand head with his left hand. The right-hand head seemed to be thoroughly preoccupied with his task, but the left-hand one was grinning a broad, relaxed, nonchalant grin. The number of things that Arthur couldn't believe he was seeing was fairly large. His jaw flopped about at a loose end for a while. The peculiar man waved a lazy wave at Ford, and with an appalling affectation of nonchalance said, Ford, hi, how are you? Glad you could drop in. Ford was not going to be out-cooled. Zaphod, he drawled. Hey, great to see you. You're looking well. The extra arm suits you. Nice ship you've stolen. Arthur goggled at him. You mean you know this guy? He said, waving a wild finger at Zaphod. Know him? Exclaimed Ford. He's... He paused and decided to do the introductions the other way round. Oh, Zaphod, this is a friend of mine, Arthur Dent, he said. I saved him when his planet blew up. Oh, sure, said Zaphod. Hi, Arthur. Glad you could make it. His right-hand head looked round casually and said hi, and went back to having his teeth picked. Ford carried on. And Arthur, he said, this is my semi-cousin, Zaphod Beebe. We've met, said Arthur sharply. When you're cruising down the road in the fast lane and you lazily sail past a few hard-driving cars and are feeling pretty pleased with yourself and then accidentally change down from fourth to first instead of third, thus making your engine leap out of your bonnet in a rather ugly mess, it tends to throw you off your stride in much the same way that this remark threw Ford Prefect off his. What? He said. I said we've met. Zaphod gave an awkward start of surprise and jabbed a gum sharply. Hey, have we? Ford rounded on Arthur with an angry flash in his eyes. Now he felt he was back on home ground. He suddenly began to resent having lumbered himself with this ignorant primitive, who knew as much about the affairs of the galaxy as an Ilford-based gnat knew about life in Peking. What do you mean you've met? He demanded. This is Zaphod Beeblebrox from Beetlejuice 5, you know, not bloody Martin Smith from Croydon. I don't care, said Arthur coldly. We've met, haven't we, Zaphod Beeblebrox? Or should I say, Phil? What? Shouted Ford. You'll have to remind me, said Zaphod. I've a terrible memory for species. It was at a party, pursued Arthur. Yeah, well, I doubt that, said Zaphod. Cool it, will you, Arthur? Demanded Ford. Arthur would not be deterred. A party 6 months ago on Earth. England. Zaphod shook his head with a tight-lipped smile. London, insisted Arthur. Islington. Oh, said Zaphod with a guilty start. Oh, that party. This wasn't fair on Ford at all. He looked backwards and forwards between Arthur and Zaphod. What? He said to Zaphod. You don't mean to say you've been on that miserable little planet as well, do you? No, of course not, said Zaphod breezily. Well, I may have just dropped in briefly, you know, on my way somewhere. But I was stuck there for 15 years, said Ford. Well, I didn't know that, did I? But what were you doing there? Oh, looking about, you know. He gate-crashed a party, said Arthur, trembling with anger. A fancy dress party. Well, it would have to be, wouldn't it, said Ford. At this party, persisted Arthur, was a girl. Oh, well, look, it doesn't matter now, and the whole place has gone up in smoke anyway. I wish you'd stop sulking about that bloody planet, said Ford. Who was the lady? Oh, just somebody. Well, all right. I wasn't doing very well with her. I'd been trying all evening. Hell, she was something, though. Beautiful, charming, devastatingly intelligent. At last I'd got her to myself for a bit and was plying her with a bit of talk when this friend of yours barges up and says, Hey, doll, is this guy boring you? Why don't you talk to me instead? I'm from a different planet. I never saw her again. Zaphod? Exclaimed Ford. Yes, said Arthur, glaring at him and trying not to feel foolish. He only had the 2 arms and the 1 head and he called himself Phil, but you must admit he did turn out to be from another planet, said Trillian, wandering into sight at the other end of the bridge. She gave Arthur a pleasant smile, which settled on him like a ton of bricks, and then turned her attention to the ship's controls again. There was silence for a few seconds, and then out of the scrambled mess of Arthur's brain crawled some words. Tricia Macmillan, he said. What are you doing here? Same as you, she said. I hitched a lift. After all, with a degree in maths and another in astrophysics, what else was there to do? It was either that or the dole queue again on Monday. Infinity minus 1, chattered the computer. Improbability sum now complete. Zaphod looked about him, at Ford, at Arthur, and then at Trillian. Trillian, he said, is this sort of thing going to happen every time we use the improbability drive? Very probably, I'm afraid, she said. Chapter 14. The Heart of Gold fled on silently through the night of space, now on conventional photon drive. Its crew of 4 were ill at ease, knowing that they had been brought together not of their own volition or by simple coincidence, but by some curious perversion of physics, as if relationships between people were susceptible to the same laws that governed the relationships between atoms and molecules. As the ship's artificial night closed in, they were each grateful to retire to separate cabins and try to rationalize their thoughts. Trillian couldn't sleep. She sat on a couch and stared at a small cage which contained her last and only links with Earth, 2 white mice that she had insisted Zaphod let her bring. She had never expected to see the planet again, but she was disturbed by her negative reaction to the news of the planet's destruction. It seemed remote and unreal, and she could find no thoughts to think about it. She watched the mice scurrying round the cage and running furiously in their little plastic treadwheels, till they occupied her whole attention. Suddenly she shook herself and went back onto the bridge to watch over the tiny flashing lights and figures that charted the ship's progress through the void. She wished she knew what it was she was trying not to think about. Zaphod couldn't sleep. He also wished that he knew what it was that he wouldn't let himself think about. For as long as he could remember, he'd suffered from a vague, nagging feeling of being not all there. Most of the time he was able to put this thought aside and not worry about it, but it had been reawakened by the sudden, inexplicable arrival of Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent. Somehow it seemed to conform to a pattern that he couldn't see. Ford couldn't sleep. He was too excited about being back on the road again. 15 years of virtual imprisonment were over, just as he was finally beginning to give up hope. Knocking about with Zaphod for a bit promised to be a lot of fun, though there seemed to be something faintly odd about his semi-cousin that he couldn't put his finger on. The fact that he had become president of the galaxy was frankly astonishing, as was the manner of his leaving the post. Was there a reason behind it? There would be no point in asking Zaphod. He never appeared to have a reason for anything he did at all. He had turned unfathomability into an art form. He attacked everything in life with a mixture of extraordinary genius and naive incompetence, and it was often difficult to tell which was which. Arthur slept. He was terribly tired. There was a tap at Zaphod's door. It slid open. Zaphod? Yeah? Trillian stood outlined in the oval of light. I think we just found what we came to look for. Hey, yeah? Ford gave up the attempt to sleep. In the corner of his cabin was a small computer screen and keyboard. He sat at it for a while and tried to compose a new entry for the guide on the subject of Vogons, but couldn't think of anything vitriolic enough, so he gave that up too, wrapped a robe around himself and went for a walk to the bridge. As he entered, he was surprised to see 2 figures hunched excitedly over the instruments. See, the ship's about to move into orbit, Trillian was saying. There's a planet out there. It's at the exact coordinates you predicted. Zaphod heard a noise and looked up. Ford, he hissed. Hey, come and have a look at this. Ford went over and had a look at it. It was a series of figures flickering over a screen. You recognize those galactic coordinates? Said Zaphod. No. I'll give you a clue. Computer? Hi, gang, enthused the computer. This is getting real sociable, isn't it? Shut up, said Zaphod, and show us the screens. Light on the bridge sank. Pinpoints of light played across the consoles and reflected in 4 pairs of eyes that stared up at the external monitor screens. There was absolutely nothing on them. Recognize that? Whispered Zaphod. Ford frowned. No, he said. What do you see? Nothing. Recognize it? What are you talking about? We're in the Horsehead Nebula, one whole vast dark cloud. And I was meant to recognize that from a blank screen? Inside a dark nebula is the only place in the galaxy you'd see a dark screen. Very good. Zaphod laughed. He was clearly very excited about something, almost childishly so. Hey, this is really terrific. This is just far too much. What's so great about being stuck in a dust cloud? Said Ford. What would you reckon to find here? Urged Zaphod. Nothing. No stars, no planets. No. Computer, shouted Zaphod. Rotate angle of vision through 180 degrees and don't talk about it. For a moment it seemed that nothing was happening. Then a brightness glowed at the edge of the huge screen. A red star the size of a small plate crept across it, followed quickly by another one, a binary system. Then a vast crescent sliced into the corner of the picture, a red glare shading away into deep black, the night side of the planet. "I found it!" cried Zaphod, thumping the console. "I found it!" Ford stared at it in astonishment. "What is it?" he said. "That," said Zaphod, "is the most improbable planet that ever existed." Chapter 15. Excerpt from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, page 634784, section 5A, entry Magrathea. Far back in the mists of ancient time, in the great and glorious days of the former galactic empire, life was wild, rich, and largely tax-free. Mighty starships plied their way between exotic suns, seeking adventure and reward amongst the furthest reaches of galactic space. In those days, spirits were brave, the stakes were high, men were real men, women were real women, and small fairy creatures from Alpha Centauri were real small fairy creatures from Alpha Centauri. And all dared to brave unknown terrors, to do mighty deeds, to boldly split infinitives that no man had split before, and thus was the empire forged. Many men, of course, became extremely rich, but this was perfectly natural and nothing to be ashamed of, because no one was really poor, at least no one worth speaking of. And for all the richest and most successful merchants, life inevitably became rather dull and niggly, and they began to imagine that this was therefore the fault of the worlds they'd settled on. None of them was entirely satisfactory. Either the climate wasn't quite right in the later part of the afternoon, or the day was half an hour too long, or the sea was exactly the wrong shade of pink. And thus were created the conditions for a staggering new form of specialist industry, custom-made luxury planet building. The home of this industry was the planet Magrathea, where hyperspatial engineers sucked matter through white holes in space to form it into dream planets. Gold planets, platinum planets, soft rubber planets with lots of earthquakes, all lovingly made to meet the exacting standards that the galaxy's richest men naturally came to expect. But so successful was this venture that Magrathea itself soon became the richest planet of all time, and the rest of the galaxy was reduced to abject poverty. And so the system broke down. The empire collapsed, and a long sullen silence settled over 1 billion hungry worlds, disturbed only by the pen-scratchings of scholars as they laboured into the night over smug little treatises on the value of a planned political economy. Magrathea itself disappeared, and its memory soon passed into the obscurity of legend. In these enlightened days, of course, no one believes a word of it. Chapter 16. Arthur awoke to the sound of argument and went to the bridge. Ford was waving his arms about. "You're crazy, Zaphod," he was saying. "Magrathea is a myth, a fairy story. It's what parents tell their kids about at night if they want them to grow up to become economists. It's..." "And that's what we are currently in orbit about," insisted Zaphod. "Look, I can't help what you may personally be in orbit around," said Ford, "but this ship..." "Computer!" shouted Zaphod. "Oh no. Hi there! This is Eddie, your shipboard computer, and I'm feeling just great, guys, and I know I'm just going to get a bundle of kicks out of any program you care to run through me." Arthur looked inquiringly at Trillian. She motioned him to come on in, but keep quiet. "Computer," said Zaphod, "tell us again what our present trajectory is." "A real pleasure, fella," it burbled. "We are currently in orbit at an altitude of 300 miles around the legendary planet of Magrathea." "Proving nothing," said Ford. "I wouldn't trust that computer to speak my weight." "I can do that for you, sure," enthused the computer, punching out more ticker tape. "I can even work out your personality problems in 10 decimal places if it'll help." Trillian interrupted. "Zaphod," she said, "any minute now we'll be swinging round to the daylight side of the planet," adding, "whatever it turns out to be." "Hey, what do you mean by that? The planet's where I predicted it would be, isn't it?" "Yes, I know there's a planet there. I'm not arguing with anyone. It's just that I wouldn't know Magrathea from any other lump of cold rock. Dawn's coming up if you want it." Okay. muttered Zaphod. Let's at least give our eyes a good time. Computer, hi there, what can I... Shut up! And give us a view of the planet again. A dark, featureless mass once more filled the screens, the planet rolling away beneath them. They watched for a moment in silence, but Zaphod was fidgety with excitement. We are now traversing the night side, he said in a hushed voice. The planet rolled on. The surface of the planet is now 300 miles beneath us, he continued. He was trying to restore a sense of occasion to what he felt should have been a great moment. Magrathea. He was piqued by Ford's sceptical reaction. Magrathea. In a few seconds, he continued, we should see there. The moment carried itself. Even the most seasoned star tramp can't help but shiver at the spectacular drama of a sunrise seen from space. But a binary sunrise is one of the marvels of the galaxy. Out of the utter blackness stabbed a sudden point of blinding light. It crept up by slight degrees and spread sideways in a thin crescent blade, and within seconds 2 suns were visible, furnaces of light searing the black edge of the horizon with white fire. Fierce shafts of colour streaked through the thin atmosphere beneath them. The fires of dawn, breathed Zaphod, the twin suns of Sulianis and Ram. Or whatever, said Ford quietly. Sulianis and Ram, insisted Zaphod. The suns blazed into the pitch of space, and a low ghostly music floated through the bridge. Marvin was humming ironically because he hated humans so much. As Ford gazed at the spectacle of light before them, excitement burnt inside him, but only the excitement of seeing a strange, new planet. It was enough for him to see it as it was. It faintly irritated him that Zaphod had to impose some ludicrous fancy onto the scene to make it work for him. All this Magrathea nonsense seemed juvenile. Isn't it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it too? All this Magrathea business seemed totally incomprehensible to Arthur. He edged up to Trillian and asked her what was going on. I only know what Zaphod's told me, she whispered. Apparently Magrathea is some kind of legend from way back which no one seriously believes in, a bit like Atlantis on Earth, except that the legends say the Magratheans used to manufacture planets. Arthur blinked at the screens and felt he was missing something important. Suddenly he realized what it was. Is there any tea on this spaceship? He asked. More of the planet was unfolding beneath them as the heart of gold streaked along its orbital path. The suns now stood high in the black sky. The pyrotechnics of dawn were over, and the surface of the planet appeared bleak and forbidding in the common light of day. Grey, dusty, and only dimly contoured, it looked dead and cold as a crypt. From time to time, promising features would appear on the distant horizon. Ravines, maybe mountains, maybe even cities. But as they approached, the lines would soften and blur into anonymity, and nothing would transpire. The planet's surface was blurred by time, by the slow movement of the thin, stagnant air that had crept across it for century upon century. Clearly, it was very, very old. A moment of doubt came to Ford as he watched the grey landscape move beneath them. The immensity of time worried him. He could feel it as a presence. He cleared his throat. Well, even supposing it is, said Zaphod. Which it isn't, continued Ford. What do you want with it anyway? There's nothing there. Not on the surface, said Zaphod. All right, just supposing there's something. I take it you're not here for the sheer industrial archaeology of it all. What are you after? One of Zaphod's heads looked away. The other one looked round to see what the first was looking at, but it wasn't looking at anything very much. Well, said Zaphod airily, it's partly the curiosity, partly a sense of adventure, but mostly I think it's just the fame and the money. Ford glanced at him sharply. He got a very strong impression that Zaphod hadn't the faintest idea why he was there at all. You know, I don't like the look of that planet at all, said Trillian, shivering. Ah, take no notice, said Zaphod. With half the wealth of the former galactic empire stored on it somewhere, it can afford to look frumpy. Bullshit, thought Ford. Even supposing this was the home of some ancient civilization now gone to dust, even supposing a number of exceedingly unlikely things, there was no way that vast treasures of wealth were going to be stored there in any form that would still have meaning now. He shrugged. "I think it's just a dead planet," he said. "The suspense is killing me," said Arthur testily. Stress and nervous tension are now serious social problems in all parts of the galaxy, and it is in order that this situation should not be in any way exacerbated that the following facts will now be revealed in advance. The planet in question is in fact the legendary Magrathea. The deadly missile attack shortly to be launched by an ancient automatic defense system will result merely in the breakage of 3 coffee cups and a mouse cage, the bruising of somebody's upper arm, and the untimely creation and sudden demise of a bowl of petunias and an innocent sperm whale. In order that some sense of mystery should still be preserved, no revelation will yet be made concerning whose upper arm sustains the bruise. This fact may safely be made the subject of suspense, since it is of no significance whatsoever. Chapter 17. After a fairly shaky start to the day, Arthur's mind was beginning to reassemble itself from the shell-shocked fragments the previous day had left him with.